Emma Whitmore slammed her tray down so hard, the glasses rattled across the bar, and every man in that saloon went quiet. "Say it again," she said. Her voice didn't shake. "Go on, say it one more time to my face." The man who had just called her a fat, useless cow leaned back in his chair and smiled like he hadn't done a single thing wrong. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke up for her. They never did. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. Emma Whitmore had been invisible her entire life, but that night in the Double Crown Saloon, she made herself impossible to ignore. She had been on her feet for 14 hours by the time Cleet Burrow opened his mouth. 14 hours of hauling coal buckets at the Morrow boarding house before the sun crept over the mountains. 14 hours of lifting flour sacks and counting inventory at Hatcher's General Store through the afternoon. And now this, her third shift of the day, carrying plates of hot food through cigarette smoke and spilled whiskey, while men twice her age talked over her head like she was furniture. She was 26 years old. She was broad-shouldered and full-figured, and wore her brown hair pinned back tight, because there was no time in her life for anything that wasn't functional. Her dress was clean, but mended twice at the hem. Her boots had been her father's, and were a half size too large. She had learned to walk without letting that show. She had learned to do a lot of things without letting them show. Cleet Burrow was the kind of man who existed in every frontier town, loud enough to fill a room small enough inside, that he needed other people's pain to feel tall. He ran a small logging operation east of Red Hollow and paid his debts when it suited him. He had a wife at home who never came to town anymore. When he drank, which was most evenings, he picked a target, and he worked it until the whole room was laughing with him, or the target walked away first. That night he picked Emma. It started small the way it always did. A comment about her size when she set down his plate. Something about the floorboards groaning. A few of the men at his table snickered. Emma kept moving. She had learned that the fastest way to end it was to give him nothing, no reaction, no eye contact, no ammunition. But Cleet wasn't finished. "Hey, Emma." His voice carried across the room. "You're gonna break that tray if you're not careful. Probably break the bar stool too, you sit on it." More laughter. Louder this time. Emma set down the next plate, kept her eyes forward. Her jaw was tight enough to ache. "Marlene used to say you were the hardest worker in Red Hollow." He leaned back, hooking his thumbs in his suspenders, with the satisfaction of a man who thought he was being clever. "Me, I always figured you just couldn't move fast enough to quit." The table erupted, and something inside Emma Whitmore cracked. Not broke. She was too stubborn to break, but cracked the way good timber cracks before it catches fire. She set the tray down, not gently. The glasses rattled, and the sound cut through the laughter like a blade. And for one sharp moment, the whole saloon went quiet. She turned and looked directly at Cleet Burrow. "Say it again," she said. Her voice was low and even, and carried the particular weight of a woman who had nothing left to lose tonight. "Go ahead. Say it one more time to my face instead of the back of my head." Cleet blinked. He wasn't used to the target turning around. "Now, Emma, my name," she said, "is Miss Whitmore. And if you've got something to say about my body, or my work, or my father, or anything else that belongs to me, you look me in the eye when you say it. That's the last time I'm going to ask you politely." The saloon was absolutely still. Cleet's face worked through several expressions: surprise, irritation, embarrassment, before settling into something uglier. He stood up slowly, the way men like him always did when they felt their performance slipping away from them. "You got a real mouth on you for someone who..." "For someone who what?" Emma didn't step back. "For someone who served you 4 whiskeys tonight and kept her mouth shut through worse. Go home, Mr. Burrow. Sleep it off. And when you come back tomorrow, you sit somewhere else." The silence stretched. Then from the far corner of the room someone set down a glass. "She's right, Cleet." A low voice. Calm. The kind of calm that didn't need to raise itself to be heard. "Man your age ought to know better." Every head turned. Howe was sitting alone at the corner table, a fact that Emma registered now, though she hadn't noticed him come in. He was somewhere past 35 broad through the chest and shoulders, The way men got from physical work, rather than fighting with dark hair, gone silver at the temples, and a face that had seen enough weather to earn every line it carried. His hat was on the table beside his drink. He hadn't touched the drink. I was watching Cleet burrow, with the kind of stillness that made Cleet take a half step back without seeming to realize he'd done it. "Nobody asked you, Carter," Cleet muttered. "No," the man said. "They didn't." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Cleet threw some coins on the table and walked out. His two companions followed without a word, the way men without real convictions always followed wherever the current pulled them. The saloon exhaled. Emma picked up her tray. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that her hands were steady, because everything else inside her was shaking like a leaf in a November wind. She moved back toward the bar, and Roy Haskell, the saloon owner, gave her a look that was somewhere between sympathy and discomfort. The way people always looked at her when something like this happened, like they felt bad, but not bad enough to have said anything themselves. "You all right?" Roy asked. "Fine," Emma said. "You sure?" "I said I'm fine, Roy." She wasn't fine, but that wasn't Roy's problem. Nothing about Emma's life had ever been anyone's problem but her own, and she had long since made her peace with that arrangement. She loaded the tray with the next round of drinks and moved back into the room. She didn't look at the man in the corner, but she felt him watching. Emma Whitmore had grown up 20 miles outside of Red Hollow in the kind of house that was modest even by frontier standards. 2 rooms, a root cellar, a wood stove that smoked when the wind came from the east. Her father, Daniel Whitmore, had been a logging man all his life. Not a rich one, not even a particularly successful one. But he had been decent and hardworking, and he had loved Emma and her mother with the particular fierce quietness of a man who showed his feelings through doing rather than saying. Her mother had died when Emma was 11. Fever fast and final. Daniel had held the family together, the only way he knew how, by working harder. Emma had learned everything from watching him. How to keep going when you were tired. How to fix what was broken before it broke worse. How to make something from very little and not complain about what you didn't have. When Emma was 22, Daniel Whitmore fell from a logging scaffold on a Tuesday morning in October and didn't survive the fall. Emma buried him on a Saturday. On Monday, she found out about the debts. It wasn't that Daniel had been reckless with money. It was that frontier life had a way of accumulating obligations. A bad season here, a borrowed tool there, a medical bill from her mother's final weeks that had never quite been paid off. When Emma sat down with the town banker Gerald Marsh and laid out everything she had inherited, she realized that her father's name was worth less than the paper his debts were written on. The house itself was mortgaged. The total owed was $480. Gerald Marsh had looked at her across his desk with the careful, practiced sympathy of a man who had delivered this kind of news many times before. "I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore. You have 60 days before the bank will need to begin the foreclosure process. Is there anyone family perhaps who could assist you?" There was no one. Emma had looked at the numbers written in Gerald Marsh's neat hand and made a decision so quiet and so absolute that it surprised even her. She was not going to lose her father's house. She was not going to walk away from the only thing that connected her to the people she had loved. She was going to work whatever it took, however many hours it consumed, until every cent of that debt was paid. "Give me time," she said. Gerald Marsh had given her time. Somewhat reluctantly. He extended the arrangement monthly, always with the suggestion that perhaps she might want to consider selling. Always with the implication that a young woman alone couldn't really sustain this. Always with that careful, practiced sympathy that Emma had started to find more exhausting than any of her 3 jobs. That had been 4 years ago. She had paid back $260. $220 remained. The work was not romanticized in Emma's mind. She did not tell herself stories about noble struggle, or the dignity of labor, or the rewards that waited for the virtuous. She was too practical for that, and too tired. The boarding house shift started at 4:30 in the morning and ran until 10. The general store shift started at 10:30 and ran until 5 in the afternoon. The saloon shift started at 6 in the evening and ran until midnight or later, depending on how busy Roy needed her. She slept from midnight until 4. She did this 6 days a week. On Sundays, she cleaned her father's house and did the mending she hadn't had time to do during the week. And sometimes, if the exhaustion wasn't too deep, she sat on the porch for an hour before dark and let herself think about something other than numbers. She thought about her father's laugh, which had been too big for a quiet man. She thought about her mother's hands, which had been small and always warm. She thought about what it might feel like to sleep past 4 o'clock. She thought sometimes in the way that people allow themselves to think about things. There certain won't happen about a life that looked different from this one. A life where someone looked at her and saw her, not her size, not her debts, not her usefulness, just her. But Emma Whitmore was not a woman who spent much time on fantasies. She had work to do. She noticed the man from the corner. Carter Cleet had called him, paying his bill at the bar before she had to look for him again. He tipped Roy, which not every man did. He put his hat back on with a single practiced motion and turned to leave, and Emma was behind the bar, restocking glasses and pretending she wasn't watching. He paused. "Miss Whitmore." She looked up. He had gray eyes, she noticed. Not blue-gray, the particular gray of early morning sky before the sun decides what kind of day it's going to be. He was looking at her directly, which was also notable because most men in Red Hollow had learned to look slightly past her, the way you learn to look past something you didn't want to have to address. "That took nerve," he said. "What you did tonight." Emma studied him for a moment. "I've been called worse things than what Cleet Burrow said tonight. I was just tired of looking at the back of the room." Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something quieter than that. "William Carter," he said. "I run the Carter Ranch, about 12 miles north." "I know who you are," Emma said. She did. Carter Ranch was one of the larger cattle operations in the county. Everyone in Red Hollow knew of it the way they knew of anything that had been there long enough to become part of the landscape. She had heard he was widowed. She had heard he kept to himself. Beyond that, she knew nothing personal, and she had never had reason to know more. "Is there something you need, Mr. Carter?" He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "Not tonight. Good evening, Miss Whitmore." He walked out. Emma stared at the door for 3 seconds longer than she meant to. Roy materialized beside her. "William Carter," he said in the particular tone Roy used when he was about to say something he thought was significant. "Hasn't been in here in near 2 years. Man keeps to himself something fierce since Margaret passed." Emma said, and went back to her glasses. "Funny he'd come in tonight of all nights," Roy said. "Roy," Emma said, "I have 16 tables to check." Roy went away. Emma checked her tables. She didn't let herself think about gray eyes or the particular quality of a voice that could stop a room without raising itself. She thought about the $11.40 she'd earned tonight, about the note she'd need to make on her ledger, about whether she'd remembered to close the root cellar at the house before coming to her shift. She was good at not thinking about things. It was one of her most reliable skills. 3 days later, William Carter walked into Hatcher's General Store at 11:15 in the morning. Emma saw him come through the door and went back to checking inventory without acknowledging the small sharp thing that happened in her chest when she recognized him. She was behind the counter cataloging thread spools by color when Frank Hatcher, who was 60 years old and moved like a man who had decided several decades ago that urgency was for other people, ambled over to greet the newcomer. "Mr. Carter, haven't seen you in town much lately." "Been busy," William said. He named a few supplies: grain nails, a specific type of rope he needed for a fence repair. Frank began pulling things from the shelves, and William moved slowly through the store, the way people did when they weren't just shopping, but looking at something without wanting to be caught looking. Emma kept counting thread spools. She made it to 47 before he stopped on the other side of the counter. "Miss Whitmore, Mr. Carter." She didn't look up immediately. Counted to 50-60, wrote the number down. Then she looked up. He was holding his hat in both hands, which was the frontier equivalent of removing armor. "I've got a proposition for you if you're willing to hear it." Emma set down her pencil. She folded her hands on the counter and gave him the kind of patient-level attention she gave to everyone who came to her with a proposition. Because in her experience, A proposition could mean anything from a legitimate business arrangement to something that required a cold response and a firm walk to the back room. "I'm listening." William Carter took a breath. He clearly wasn't a man who made speeches. Whatever he was about to say had been prepared, and it still cost him something to say it. "My ranch house needs managing," he said. "I've had 3 housekeepers in the past 4 years. None of them stayed. The work's hard, the location's isolated, and I'll be the first to admit, I'm not an easy man to live in proximity to." He paused. "I need someone organized. Someone who can handle accounts, manage supply orders, coordinate with the ranch hands about meals and schedules. Someone who doesn't quit the first time things get difficult." Emma looked at him steadily. "What's the pay?" $50 a month, he said, plus room and board. She didn't let her expression change, but $50 a month was more than she made across all 3 jobs combined. It was the kind of number that could change the entire shape of a problem. "Why me?" she asked. He didn't look away. "Because I watched you stand down Cleetborough 3 nights ago without raising your voice and without backing up an inch. Because Frank Hatcher told me you've been working 3 jobs for 4 years and you've never missed a shift. And because—" He stopped, seemed to choose his next words with particular care. "Because the women I've interviewed who seemed suitable all told me they'd seen the Carter Ranch and they had concerns about the remoteness. They wanted to know if I intended to find a new wife soon, because that would change the nature of the arrangement." He looked at the counter between them. "I'm not looking for a wife, Miss Whitmore. I'm looking for someone who can do a job. And I have the impression you're not the type who complicates things that ought to be simple." Emma was quiet for a moment. "50 a month," she said. "Plus room and board, yes." "I'd need Sundays free to maintain my own property." He nodded. "That's reasonable." "I'd need the terms in writing." "I expected that. And I'd need 2 weeks to give notice at my current positions and make arrangements." She paused. "I also need to speak with people who can speak to your character. Not because I doubt you. I don't know you well enough to doubt you yet, but because I've been making decisions alone for a long time, and I'm not going to stop being careful now." Something shifted in William Carter's expression, and this time she could identify it. It was respect. Clean and straightforward, the kind that didn't come with conditions attached. "That's the wisest thing anyone said to me in some time," he said. "You can speak to Sheriff Aldridge. You can speak to Gerald Marsh at the bank. I've done business there for 15 years. You can speak to Dale Hennessy, who sells me my cattle. He's known me since before my wife passed. Anyone in town who knows the Carter name." "All right," Emma said. She picked up her pencil again, opened her ledger, made a note. "I'll have an answer for you in 1 week," she said. "Come back next Thursday." William Carter put his hat back on. He nodded once, the kind of nod that meant more than it showed. "Thursday," he said, and walked out. Frank Hatcher appeared from behind a shelf of canned goods, moving with considerably more speed than Emma had ever seen him manage. "Did William Carter just offer you a job?" "He offered me a proposition," Emma said. "I haven't accepted anything." "Emma." Frank lowered his voice, though they were alone in the store. "That man has more money than most people in this county, and he's lived like a monk since Margaret died. He practically never comes to town. The fact that he came here specifically—" "Frank," Emma said pleasantly, "I have 53 more thread spools to count." Frank went away. Emma finished counting. She wrote every number down. She did not let herself feel the terrible, cautious, dangerous thing stirring somewhere under the practical surface of her thoughts. The thing that wondered what it might mean to wake up somewhere other than the boarding house at 4 in the morning, to fall asleep somewhere other than a saloon after midnight, to have enough money that she might finally put the last of her father's debts to rest. She was not going to hope. Not yet. Not until she knew. But she did quietly, and against her better judgment, think about gray eyes. Chung. She spoke to Sheriff Aldridge on a Tuesday. He was a laconic man in his mid-50s who had been keeping the peace in Red Hollow for over 2 decades, and he told her about William Carter. The way men tell you about other men they've decided are worth telling you about straight and spare no decoration. "Came here from Wyoming about 16 years ago, the sheriff said. Built his operation from almost nothing. Honest with his money, fair with his hands, never needed me for anything worse than a property dispute with a neighbor, which he settled out of court because he didn't want the bother of a hearing. Margaret, his wife, she was a good woman. They didn't have children. When she got sick, he didn't leave her side for the last 6 months. When she died, he closed the ranch house up for a while, hired people to keep the operation going, but wouldn't go inside himself. He looked at Emma over his coffee cup. He's lonely, Emma. That's not a character flaw. That's just a fact. I know, Emma said. I just needed to make sure that was all it was. Aldridge nodded. That's all it is. She spoke to Gerald Marsh on Wednesday. The banker was more careful than the sheriff, choosing each word with the precision of a man who made his living, understanding the difference between a commitment and an implication. But the substance was the same. William Carter was financially sound, scrupulously honest, had no debts and no disputes unresolved, and had been managing his property with discipline and consistency for the better part of 2 decades. He's also frankly a private man to a degree that strikes some people as unfriendliness, Marsh said. I want to be transparent about that. His ranch is isolated. He doesn't socialize. Working in close quarters with someone like that can be... He stopped, seemed to select another word. Demanding. Mr. Marsh, Emma said, I get up at 4 in the morning 6 days a week. I don't find things demanding so much as variable. The banker looked at her with something she hadn't seen in his expression before. Miss Whitmore, he said, I think you would be very good at the job he's describing. She went home that night to her father's house, the one she rose before dawn to protect, and sat at the kitchen table with her ledger and her candle and worked through every number twice. She had $220 left to pay. At $50 a month, setting aside $30 for personal expenses, she could put $20 a month toward the debt. In 11 months, she could be free. 11 months. Against 4 more years of 3 jobs, 4 hours of sleep, and Cleet Burrow's voice carrying across a crowded room. She closed the ledger. She blew out the candle. She sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about her father's hands, how they had always been rough from work, how he had never seemed to mind how she had inherited those hands and that willingness from him, and was only now beginning to understand what a gift it was. All right, Dad, she said to the dark kitchen. Let's see what this turns into. On Thursday, William Carter came back to the general store at 11:15, with the precision of a man who meant what he said about time. Emma had already spoken to Frank, who was philosophical about losing her, and also clearly struggling not to ask approximately 40 follow-up questions. She had spoken to Roy at the saloon, who had looked sad in the distracted way of someone who hadn't realized how much he relied on a person until they gave notice. She had arranged with Adeline Morrow, who ran the boarding house, for someone to cover the morning shift starting in 2 weeks. She had done everything that needed doing. She had been ready since Tuesday. When William Carter walked through the door, she met his eyes across the store and gave him a small, clear nod. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically, he wasn't a dramatic man, but something eased there around the jaw, and the eyes, like a knot that had been held tightly, was released by one careful degree. He walked to the counter. She slid a folded paper across to him, the written terms she'd drafted herself in her clear, practiced handwriting. $50 per month. Board and room. Sundays reserved. 6-month probationary period after which either party could end the arrangement with 2 weeks' notice. He read it without speaking. He reached into his coat and produced his own folded paper. Her terms copied in his handwriting with 2 additions. A clause about her right to return to Red Hollow on personal business when needed, and a note that the kitchen garden, if she chose to plant one, would be considered her project entirely, with the produce at her discretion. She read it without speaking. They looked at each other across the counter. Thursday week, he said. Thursday week, she agreed. He put out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and treated her hand like it was the hand of a person, which was more than a lot of men managed. He left. Frank Hatcher erupted from behind the grain sacks where he had been so obviously eavesdropping that Emma briefly considered charging him for the entertainment. You're really going, Frank said. I'm really going, Emma confirmed. To the Carter Ranch. To the Carter Ranch. With William Carter. With my employment contract with William Carter, yes, Frank. Frank sat down heavily on a nearby barrel. "Emma Whitmore," he said, "you are the most surprising woman I have ever had the privilege of employing." Emma picked up her pencil. "Don't make it strange, Frank." "I'm not making it strange, I'm saying, I have inventory to finish." She went back to her inventory. But for the first time in 4 years, when she wrote the numbers in her ledger, her handwriting was lighter, like the pencil wasn't being pressed down quite so hard. The week before she left was strange in the particular way that transitions are strange. She was still doing all the same things, but the doing of them had changed shape. The boarding house at 4:30, the store until 5, the saloon until midnight, the brief dark walk home. But now she was watching it all from a slight remove, the way you watch a place you're about to leave. Noticing details she had stopped seeing because they were too familiar. The way the boarding house kitchen smelled of wood smoke and old grease. The particular creak of the second step at Hatcher's that had never been fixed. The way Roy wiped down the bar in the same direction every time, left to right, as if the bar had a preference. These were things she had spent 4 years not thinking about, and now they were pressing themselves into her attention like they wanted to be remembered. What she did not expect was the people. On Wednesday evening, Adeline Morrow called her into the sitting room of the boarding house before her shift was done. 3 of the other women who boarded there were present women. Emma had cooked breakfast for every morning. Women whose names she knew and whose routines she could describe in detail. Women she had never sat down with and spoken to as equals because she had always been the help and they had always been the guests. Adeline set a small cake on the table. "We made it yesterday," she said in the brisk way of a woman who was not comfortable with sentiment but had decided sentiment was required. "It's not much, but you've been up before any of us for 4 years. Seemed wrong to let you go without acknowledging it." Emma looked at the cake. It was lopsided. Someone had written her name on it in what appeared to be frosting applied with a spoon. She sat down. She ate cake with women she hadn't realized had been paying attention, and she thought that this particular surprise might be the thing she missed most when she was 12 miles north at the Carter Ranch. Not the saloon or the general store or the grinding rhythm of 3 shifts a day, but this. The small evidence that people had seen her even when they hadn't said so. "You'll do well out there," Adeline said. When Emma looked at her, the older woman was looking at her hands, her own. "William Carter's a good man. He just doesn't know how to be around people anymore. You'll help him with that." "It's a job, Adeline," Emma said. Adeline looked up. Her eyes were sharp and kind at the same time, the way eyes get when a person has lived long enough to see past the words people use to the things they mean. "Of course it is," she said. The cake was slightly dry. Emma ate 2 pieces. Her last night at the saloon, Roy paid her what he owed and added an extra $2 that he tucked under her whiskey glass when he thought she wasn't watching. She took the money without embarrassing him by making it a conversation. On her way out, she stopped at the end of the bar. "Roy," she said. He looked up from his wiping. "Left to right. Always left to right. You could say something, you know, the next time, when someone's at a table being the way Cleet was." She wasn't angry about it. She just wanted him to know. You don't have to make a speech. You just have to say something, even one thing. Roy was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I know. I'm sorry I didn't." Emma nodded. She picked up her coat from the hook by the door. "Take care of yourself," she said. "You too, Emma," he said. She walked out into the cool Montana night, and for the first time in 4 years, she walked home without calculating the next day's schedule in her head. Tomorrow was Sunday. Tomorrow she was going to sleep until 7 and sit on her father's porch and let herself be still. And then Thursday, she was going to climb into William Carter's wagon and drive 12 miles north and begin the next thing. She walked home through the dark. The mountains were a black edge against a sky thick with stars, the way Montana sky got in the deep part of autumn. She had lived under this sky her whole life. She had walked this road in every season, in every weather. In states of exhaustion she couldn't have described to anyone who hadn't felt it. She felt it now, the exhaustion bone deep and real. But under it, something else. Something she was almost afraid to name. She named it anyway. Hope. Not the reckless, demanding kind that set you up to fall. Just the small, quiet, carefully maintained kind. The kind that looked like a number on a ledger getting smaller. The kind that looked like a contract in her own handwriting. The kind that looked like gray eyes and a man who had put his hat in his hands and said the words no one in Red Hollow had ever thought to say to her. I need someone who knows what it means to fight for something. Emma Whitmore walked home under the Montana stars and thought that yes, she did know what that meant. She had been doing it her entire life. She was just about to find out what it led to. Thursday came the way important days always do, without ceremony, without warning, arriving exactly when it said it would, and not caring at all about the person who had spent the preceding week trying to prepare for it. Emma was ready before dawn. Not because she needed to be. William Carter had said he would come for her at 8, but because her body had been waking at 4:30 for 4 years, and it had no intention of adjusting itself for one morning, simply because everything was about to change. She lay in the dark for an hour, listening to the house breathe around her. The way the wood settled. The particular silence that belonged to this place and no other. She had grown up in this silence, and she knew every variation of it. The quiet before rain, the quiet after snow, the quiet of a Sunday morning when the town was still sleeping. She got up. She made coffee. She sat at her father's kitchen table with her hands wrapped around the cup and looked at the room she had cleaned every Sunday for 4 years. The stove he had built. The shelf he had put up crooked and never straightened because her mother had laughed at it and he hadn't wanted to lose the reason for that laugh. She had packed one trunk. Everything she owned that mattered fit inside it with room to spare, which told her something about the life she'd been living that she didn't have to think too hard to understand. She was 26 years old, and she was about to do the bravest and most uncertain thing she had ever done, and she was doing it alone, which was how she had done everything that mattered since she was 22. At 7:30, she carried the trunk to the porch. At 8 o'clock exactly, she heard wheels on the road. William Carter drove a good wagon, solid, well-maintained, pulled by 2 horses that moved with the quiet discipline of animals properly cared for. He came to a stop in front of the house and climbed down without rushing, which was something Emma had already noticed about him. He didn't rush. He moved through the world like a man who had decided a long time ago that most things worth doing were worth doing at the right pace. He looked at the trunk on the porch. He looked at Emma. That everything? He asked. That's everything, she said. He picked up the trunk without asking her if she needed help or commenting on its weight, just picked it up and put it in the wagon bed with the efficiency of a man who was simply doing the next necessary thing. Emma appreciated that more than she could have explained. The men in her life had either ignored her entirely or made a production of every interaction, and William Carter did neither. He offered his hand to help her up onto the wagon seat. She took it. His grip was the same as it had been when they shook hands across the counter, firm, brief, treating her hand like the hand of a person. She settled onto the seat. He walked around and climbed up on his side and picked up the reins, and they pulled out onto the road heading north, and Emma did not look back at her father's house. She had already said goodbye in the dark kitchen at 5 in the morning. She didn't need to do it again. They rode in silence for a while, which suited Emma. She had never understood people who felt obligated to fill silence with noise. The road north of Red Hollow was good for the first few miles, and then became the kind of road that required attention, ruts and stones, and the occasional creek crossing where the water was low enough to drive through, but high enough to require judgment. William navigated it without hesitation. He knew this road the way she knew the boarding house kitchen. After about 20 minutes, he said, "I should tell you about the ranch hands." "Please," Emma said. "3 men who live on the property. Hector Reyes. He's been with me 12 years. Runs the cattle operations. You won't need to manage him so much as coordinate with him about meals and supplies. He's trustworthy, and he minds his own business." He paused. Owen Briggs. He's younger, 21. Good worker when he's focused. He talks more than the other 2 combined, and he has opinions about everything which he will share with you whether you ask or not. "I've dealt with talkative," Emma said. "The third is Tom Aldrich, quiet. Keeps to himself even more than Hector." I'll tell you now that he doesn't warm up quickly, and he may seem unfriendly. He's not unfriendly. He just doesn't see the point of talking until he knows someone. Emma considered this. I can respect that. William glanced at her. I thought you might. He looked back at the road. They know you're coming. I told them you'd be managing the house and coordinating supplies and meals. I told them they were to treat you with respect or answer to me directly. Did you need to say that? Emma asked. No, he said. But I said it anyway. She looked at her hands in her lap. Thank you. Don't thank me for the floor, he said. It's just the floor. She understood what he meant. The floor, the basic expectation of decency, wasn't a favor. It was just the minimum. He was right. She shouldn't have to thank anyone for that. But she also knew that in her experience, the minimum was rarer than it should have been. They rode on. The mountains came closer, the way mountains do when you're actually heading toward them rather than watching them from town. They grew up out of the horizon slowly, and then suddenly they were everywhere, filling the whole sky, and the air changed quality, got sharper and cleaner and colder by degrees. Emma breathed it in. It's beautiful, she said before she could decide whether to say it. Yes, William said, simple as that, not explaining it, not performing any feeling about it, just agreeing. She decided she liked that about him. The Carter Ranch house was not what she'd expected, which she realized said more about her expectations than about the house itself. She had imagined something either grand, the home of a successful man who wanted to show his success, or neglected the way things get neglected when no one is paying attention with any love. It was neither. It was a substantial house, 2 full floors, a wide porch, a kitchen that was clearly the largest room built for function and built well. But it had the particular quality of a place that had been lived in by someone who cared about it and then had the caring removed. Not dirty, not broken, just hollow. The way a room feels when it's been cleaned but no one sits in it. The 3 ranch hands were working when they arrived, Hector by the barn, not looking up but aware. Owen, who was indeed 21, and had the particular quality of a young man who had decided the new arrival was interesting, stopped what he was doing entirely. Tom near the fence line did not stop, but turned his head fractionally and then turned it back. Owen walked over. Miss Whitmore, he said. He had a wide-open face and the kind of smile that happened without the person deciding to do it. Owen Briggs, I'm real glad you've come. The cooking situation has been... He stopped, glanced at William. It's been something of a challenge. Mr. Briggs, Emma said. Owen, please, Miss Whitmore. Or Emma, if that's... Miss Whitmore is fine for now, Emma said pleasantly. Owen blinked. Yes, ma'am. William had already climbed down and was lifting her trunk from the wagon bed. I'll show you the house, he said. The house was exactly what she'd expected once she was inside it. Large, functional, and empty in the way that mattered. The kitchen was good. Good stove, good work table, a pantry that had supplies but no organization. She walked through it slowly, cataloging without speaking. Flour, cornmeal, salt pork. Coffee, good coffee. She noted the expensive kind. Dried beans enough for a month at least. Canned goods. No fresh vegetables, no preserved anything she could see. The garden, she said. There used to be one, William said. He was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room. Margaret's. It wasn't kept up. Emma nodded. She didn't push it. I'll start one in the spring. For now, I'll work with what's here and add to it on the supply runs. She turned to look at him. When do you go to town for supplies? Hector goes every 2 weeks, Tuesday usually. I'll make the list. He checks it with me before he goes and brings back exactly what's on it. Nothing added or substituted without asking me first. She said it not as a request, but as the way things were going to be. Something in William's expression shifted that same quality she'd seen across the general store counter. Respect, clean, and uncomplicated. I'll tell him. Good. She looked around the kitchen once more. I'll need an hour to understand the house before I start on supper. What time do the men eat? 6 usually. She checked the clock on the wall. It was just past 10. That's enough time. You go do what you need to do. I'll find you if I need anything. He hesitated in the doorway for exactly 1 second, which she suspected was unusual for him. He didn't strike her as a man who hesitated. Then he nodded and went. Emma stood alone in the Carter Ranch kitchen. She put her hands flat on the work table. She took one breath. Then she got to work. She had supper ready at 6 o'clock. Beans cooked with salt pork and onion cornbread that was better than it had any right to be, given what she'd had to work with, coffee strong enough to mean business. She had also found a jar of preserved peaches in the back of the pantry, old but still good, and had made something simple with them that served as the kind of finish to a meal that told the people eating it that someone had thought about them while cooking. The four men sat at the table. Emma served and did not sit because that was the arrangement in her mind. She was not a guest. She was the person who ran this kitchen, and she needed to understand how they ate before she decided where she fit in the rhythm of it. Hector Reyes ate steadily and said midway through the meal, "Good beans, Miss Whitmore." "Thank you, Mr. Reyes." Owen ate like a man who had been significantly underfed recently. He said between mouthfuls, "This is Miss Whitmore. This is genuinely, I cannot tell you what a difference." "Eat first," Emma said. "Tell me after." Owen ate. Tom Aldrich ate without speaking, which she had expected, and without looking at her, which she also expected, but also without the particular aggressive quality that some silent men had, the silence that was a message. His silence was just silence. She appreciated the distinction. William ate without comment, but he ate everything which was its own comment. After the men had gone back to their quarters, Emma cleaned the kitchen with the thoroughness of a woman who believed that the state of a kitchen told you everything you needed to know about the state of a house. It was a good kitchen. It just needed attention. She was putting the last of the dishes away when she heard boots on the kitchen floor and looked up to find William standing at the table. "You didn't eat," he said. "I'll eat when I'm done." "You're done now." She looked at him. He had that stillness again. The stillness that wasn't passive, that was actually quite active in its own way. Like water that looked still but was moving underneath. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I appreciate the concern, but I've been managing my own meals for 4 years. I know when to eat." "Sit down," he said. He was already at the stove pouring coffee, setting a plate of the beans she'd kept aside. He set it on the table. He sat across from where the plate was, not at the head where he'd sat for supper, but across like a conversation rather than a hierarchy. She looked at the plate. She sat down. She ate. He drank his coffee and didn't watch her eat in the way that would have been uncomfortable, just occupied the same space with the ease of a man who was accustomed to quiet and didn't require it to be filled. After a few minutes she said, "The pantry needs reorganizing. I'll do it tomorrow." "All right," he said. "Your supply list is built for 4 men with no regard for efficiency. You're spending more than you need to." He looked at her. "You could tell that from one look." "I spent 4 years managing inventory at Hatcher's," she said. "Yes, I can tell." He was quiet for a moment. "How much more than I need to?" "I won't know exactly until I see 2 or 3 supply cycles. But my estimate is between $8 and $12 a month wasted." That landed. She could see it land, not because he winced, but because something in his posture changed slightly, the way a man changes when information reconfigures something in his thinking. "That's a significant waste," he said. "It is," she agreed. "I'll fix it." He nodded. He looked at his coffee. Then he said without preamble, "Margaret was the one who managed the house, all of it. I didn't understand the half of what she did until she was gone, and I had to start figuring it out without her." Emma looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the table or somewhere past it. "That's how it usually goes," she said gently. "You don't know what someone holds up until they put it down." He was quiet for a long time. "She would have liked you," he said finally. She had no patience for people who couldn't be straight with her. Emma wasn't sure what to do with that. She ate the last of her beans. She stood and took her plate to the basin. "Good night, Mr. Carter," she said. "Good night, Miss Whitmore," he said. She went up the stairs to the room he'd showed her that morning, small, clean, with a window that faced north. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window and thought about a woman she'd never met, who had planted a garden and managed a house and been loved by a man who was still learning how to be alone without her. Then she lay down and closed her eyes. She was asleep in 4 minutes. The first time in 4 years she'd slept before midnight. The first week was information constant, relentless, necessary. Emma moved through the house the way she moved through everything, systematically and without sentiment, understanding before acting. She cataloged every supply, every broken hinge, every place where the routine of the house had calcified into habit because no one had questioned it. The pantry reorganization took most of the first morning. She found supplies she suspected no one knew were there. A crock of lard pushed to the back, 2 sacks of rice. She wasn't sure anyone had intended to buy a quantity of dried apples that had been there long enough to be emphatic about it. She tossed what was gone, organized what remained by category and frequency of use, and made a list of what needed to be added. Hector watched her do this from the doorway of the kitchen with the expression of a man watching something he'd been wanting to see happen for a long time, but had been wise enough not to say so. "You've been running the supply orders?" she asked him without turning around. "Yes, ma'am." "And Mr. Carter approved the lists?" "He signed them." She turned and looked at Hector Reyes. He was a compact, weathered man in his late 40s, with the unhurried competence that came from spending decades doing one thing with full attention. He met her eyes without guile. "He trusted me," Hector said, which was not quite the same as saying the lists had been good. "I'm not criticizing," Emma said. "You were doing the best you could with what you had. I'm just going to change what you have to work with." Hector nodded. Then after a moment he said, "You want me to show you the rest of the property, so you know what we need?" She did want that. They spent 2 hours walking the ranch, the barn, the outbuildings, the areas where the cattle grazed the fence line, where Tom Aldrich was working on a repair. She asked questions, and Hector answered them, and by the end of those 2 hours, she had a picture of the operation that was clear enough to be useful. What she saw was this. The ranch itself was healthy. The cattle were good. The land was managed well. The work that Hector and his men did was solid and consistent. But the house and the logistics supporting the house were running on 4-year-old infrastructure that nobody had thought to update. The waste wasn't dramatic. No single thing was wildly wrong, but it was the kind of accumulated inefficiency that cost real money over time and wore people down without them realizing it. She could fix this. She knew she could fix this. The knowledge sat in her chest like something warm. It was Owen Briggs at the end of the first week who inadvertently created the first real test. He was in the kitchen on Friday evening while Emma was finishing the supper prep, talking in his relentless way about nothing in particular, and then suddenly talking about something particular in the way that young men sometimes talk about important things, sideways, not looking directly at what they mean. "People in town talk," he said, studying his coffee cup with great attention. "About you being out here, I mean, with Mr. Carter." Emma did not stop what she was doing. "People in town always talk," she said. "That's what towns do." "Yeah, but—" He stopped, started again. "I mean, some of them are saying things that aren't kind." Emma set down her knife. She turned and looked at Owen Briggs with the particular attention she reserved for moments that required it. "Owen," she said, "how old are you?" 21, ma'am. "And in your 21 years have you ever found it useful to report to a woman what unkind things people are saying about her?" Owen thought about this with apparent sincerity. "No," he said slowly. "I guess not." "Then you and I are going to have an agreement," she said. "What the town says about me is the town's business. What happens on this ranch is ours. You keep that line clear and we'll get along fine. Can you do that?" Owen straightened in his chair. Something in him recalibrated. She could see it happening the way young men recalibrate when a woman treats them like they're capable of better. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I can do that." "Good." She picked up her knife. "Now go wash up for supper." He went. And from that evening on, Owen Briggs became one of the most reliably decent people on the property, in the way that young people become decent when someone expects it of them clearly enough. Jump tug. 2 weeks into her time at the ranch, Emma was in the barn looking for a particular tool she needed for a repair when she heard voices on the other side of the wall. William's voice, and another, a man she didn't know. The whole county's wondering William. The unknown man's voice was familiar and easy, the voice of someone who'd known William long enough to say whatever he thought. "Woman your age, woman like that living on your property. Her name is Miss Whitmore," William said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Flat. The kind of flat that wasn't calm, but was containing something. "I'm not saying anything wrong by it. I'm just saying people are going to make assumptions. Let them. I'm trying to be your friend here, Will. I'm saying." "I know what you're saying," William said. "And I'm telling you it's not your concern. Miss Whitmore is the finest employee this ranch has had in 20 years, and I won't have her reputation made into a subject of conversation because small-minded people have nothing better to do." Silence. "Finest employee," the other man repeated. His voice had shifted, less concerned, more curious. "That all she is?" "Dale," William said with a quietness that was clearly the last thing before something that was not quiet. "You're a friend. I'd like you to stay one." Emma had heard enough. She picked up the tool she'd come for and walked out through the other door without making herself known. She stood in the cold air with the tool in her hand and breathed. He had called her the finest employee this ranch had had in 20 years. He had done it without hesitation, without qualification. She told herself that was simply because it was true, and he was an honest man. She told herself that was all it was. But her hands, which were always steady, were not entirely steady as she walked back to the house, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge why. The second week brought the first real crisis. A section of the house's root cellar had been slowly taking on water, not dramatically, not in a way that flooded, but steadily enough that 3 of the storage crates had begun to rot from the bottom. Emma discovered it on a Tuesday morning when she went down for onions and found the crate they were in soft at the base and smelling of damp. She went to find William immediately. How was in the barn office working on his cattle records, which he did every Tuesday. She had already learned his patterns, the way you learn the patterns of a house you're trying to understand. "Root cellars taking water," she said from the doorway. He looked up. "Left section back wall. It's been going long enough that the floor crates are compromised. We haven't lost much yet, but we will if it's not addressed this week." He was already on his feet. "Show me." She showed him. He stood in the root cellar and looked at the wall and the floor with the expression of a man who was doing rapid mental calculations. "I know where it's coming from," he said. "There's a drainage issue on the north side of the house that I've been meaning to address." "How long have you been meaning to address it?" He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. "About 18 months. Mr. Carter." "I know, Miss Whitmore. This is the kind of thing that becomes expensive if you—" "I know. Let it go past a certain—" "Emma." He said her name, her first name, which he hadn't used before, without appearing to realize he'd done it. "I know. I should have fixed it. I'll send to town for what I need by end of week." She registered the name. She did not make anything of it in front of him. "By end of week the damage may be worse," she said. "What would it take to get a temporary fix in place by tomorrow?" I thought about it. He told her what he needed. She told him what they had in the outbuildings that might serve until the proper supplies arrived. They worked through it in the root cellar, like 2 engineers solving a problem back and forth, each building on what the other said. And somewhere in the middle of it, Emma realized that this particular way of thinking through a problem together was something she hadn't experienced before. Not like this. Not as an equal contributor to the solution. "All right," William said when they'd worked it out. "I can start on it this afternoon. I'll have Hector help you." "I don't need—" "Hector's stronger than he looks, and you'll get it done in half the time," Emma said. "You can spend the other half on your cattle records." William looked at her for a moment. "Do you manage everyone this efficiently?" "When they let me," she said. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. It was a quiet sound, shorter than it should have been, like a man slightly surprised to find himself doing it. But it was real, and it changed his face completely, and Emma turned and went back up the cellar stairs before he could see what happened to her expression when he did it. The thing about close quarters is that you learn people faster than you mean to. Emma had not anticipated this. She had understood intellectually that living on the same property as a person was different from working in a town where your paths crossed occasionally. She had not understood it in her body, that the proximity of daily life has a way of wearing away the surface of a person until you start to see what's underneath. She learned that William Carter woke earlier than she did, which she had not thought possible. She learned that he was out at the barn before 5 most mornings. She learned that he took his coffee black and strong and stood on the porch to drink it looking north every morning without exception, and that whatever he was seeing when he looked north wasn't the mountains. She learned that he was meticulous about certain things and completely indifferent about others in the particular way of a person who had made a private list of what mattered a long time ago and had never revisited it. She learned that he read at night, not frontier novels, not newspapers, but serious books, the kind with small print and no pictures, which she found stacked on a table in the main room with small slips of paper marking places. She noticed the titles without commenting on them, filing the information away as another piece of the picture she was assembling. And she learned slowly, almost without realizing she was learning it, that every time she came into a room where he was, something in the quality of the room changed. Not dramatically, not in a way she could have pointed to and named. Just the quality of his attention shifted the way a man's attention shifts when someone enters who he's been aware of. She told herself she was imagining it. She was not imagining it. Hector noticed. Of course Hector noticed. Hector was the kind of man who noticed everything and said only the things that absolutely required saying. He said nothing about it, but on the 3rd week when he and Emma were going over the supply list together, he looked up and said without context, "He's been better since you came. Eating better, sleeping better, I think. It's been a hard few years for him." Emma kept her eyes on the list. "He's working less hard because the house is being properly managed," she said. "It's not complicated." Hector made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been the polite acknowledgement of a statement he found incomplete. He went back to the list. The twist came at the end of the 3rd week, and it came in the form of a letter. Emma was sorting the mail that Hector had brought back from town, part of her organizational system, since the mail had previously been piled wherever William set it down, when she found an envelope addressed to William from the Red Hollow Bank, from Gerald Marsh. She didn't open it. It wasn't hers to open. She set it on William's desk with his other correspondence and thought nothing more of it. That evening, William was quiet, in a way that was different from his usual quiet. His usual quiet was settled the stillness of a man at rest. This was the quiet of a man holding something still because he was afraid of what would happen if he let it move. He waited until after supper, until the hands had gone, and the kitchen was clean, and Emma was making notes for the following week's supply list. He came and stood in the kitchen doorway. "That letter from Gerald Marsh," he said. Emma looked up. "I left it on your desk." "I know. I read it." He came into the kitchen and sat down at the table, not the head across where he'd sat that first night. "Gerald is calling in a note. A 5-year note I took on a property expansion. It comes due in 4 months." Emma set down her pencil. "How much?" he told her. She did not react outwardly. But the number was large enough to significantly impact a well-run operation, large enough to explain the quality of stillness he'd brought to supper. "You knew this was coming," she said. "It wasn't an accusation. I knew it was coming in 4 months, he said. 4 months felt long enough to manage. But I've had an unexpected loss in the cattle count this autumn. Sickness took 8 head, and the replacement cost puts me in a position I didn't anticipate." Emma was already thinking. She could feel it happening, the part of her mind that organized and calculated, moving through the numbers he'd given her, looking for the shape of a solution. "How much flexibility does Marsh have on the timeline?" she asked. "Gerald's not a hard man, but he's got a board to answer to. If you went to him with a concrete repayment plan, structured specific, would he extend by 2 months? Possibly. And the cattle replacement, can you reduce that cost by sourcing from someone other than your usual supplier? Someone closer?" He looked at her. "You're asking me about my cattle business." "I'm asking you about a financial problem on a ranch I'm managing," Emma said. "Those are connected things." He was quiet for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Dale Hennessy isn't my only option, he said slowly. There's a man up toward Billings, Sam Pruitt, who runs good stock, and I've bought from him before. His prices are better. Then contact Sam Pruitt, Emma said, and I'll draw up a repayment schedule that we can take to Gerald Marsh. She picked up her pencil. I've been keeping the ranch accounts. I know the numbers. Let me show you where there's margin you haven't been using. William was staring at her in a way that she found she couldn't entirely categorize. Miss Whitmore, he said, you were hired to manage the house. The house and the ranch are the same operation, she said. You can tell me to stay in my lane if that's what you want, but you'd be making a mistake. Another silence. Show me, he said. She showed him. For the next hour, they sat at the kitchen table with Emma's account ledger between them, and she walked him through what she had seen in 3 weeks of managing his household finances. The waste, the inefficiency, but also the margins. The places where a different choice compounded into real savings over time. She was precise, and she was quick, and she watched his face as she showed him. Watched him track the numbers with the focused attention of a man who took money seriously. At the end of it, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. You've found $30 a month, he said. Closer to $35 over time, she said. In 3 weeks. I had good material to work with. The ranch itself is sound. You've just been losing ground around the edges. He looked at her. The gray eyes were direct and entirely without the complicated overlay of judgment she'd spent her life navigating from other people. He stopped. Started differently. I knew you were capable. I didn't know you were another stop. This capable. Emma held his gaze steadily. Most people don't, she said. They don't look long enough to find out. The words sat in the kitchen between them. William Carter didn't look away. He looked at her with the careful attention of a man who was in the process of revising something significant in his understanding. Not about the ranch accounts, not about the numbers on her ledger, but about her, about what she was, about what she might be. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. Emma frowned. For what? For the way I framed the offer I made you, he said. When I came to you at Hatcher's, I told you I needed someone dependable, someone who knew what it meant to fight for something. He paused. That was true, but I undersold it. I said it like you were someone who had survived difficulty. I should have said it like you were someone who had done something impressive with it. Those aren't the same thing. Emma was very still. She had been told many things in 26 years. She had been told she was too big, too stubborn, too plain, too determined for her own good. She had been told she was hardworking in the way people say hardworking when they mean they can't find anything kinder to say. She had been told she was capable occasionally, usually by people who were surprised by it. She had never been told by anyone that what she had built out of her hardship was impressive. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily. But something shifted in her chest, some tight and long-held thing, and she felt it shift, and she looked down at her ledger for a moment, so he couldn't see what was happening in her face. Thank you, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. I mean it, he said. I know, she said. That's why it matters. She closed the ledger. She stood. She looked at William Carter across the kitchen table, this quiet, complicated, lonely man who had walked into a saloon 3 weeks ago and changed the entire direction of her life by looking at her like she was the person he'd been looking for. I'll have the repayment schedule ready for Marsh by Friday, she said. And I'd write to Sam Pruitt tomorrow if I were you. I will, he said. Good night, Mr. Carter. Good night, Miss Whitmore, he said. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, and she thought about a man who had revised his understanding of her in real time, sitting at a kitchen table over a ledger, and had thought to tell her so. She pressed her hand flat against her chest. Steady, she told herself. But her heart under her hand was doing something it had never quite done before, and for the first time in her life, she didn't try to make it stop. The repayment schedule Emma drafted for Gerald Marsh was 4 pages long, handwritten in her clearest script, with figures organized by month and margin, notated in a separate column she'd added because she knew Marsh thought in columns. She had it ready by Thursday evening one day, ahead of what she'd promised. Because that was how Emma Whitmore operated. She told you when something would be done, and then she got it done before that. William read it at the kitchen table without speaking. He read it twice. He turned back to the second page and read something again. Then he set it down and looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of being genuinely surprised, which was quieter than most people's surprise, more internal, barely visible on the surface, but entirely real underneath. You modeled 3 different scenarios, he said. In case Marsh pushes back on the primary timeline, Emma said. The second scenario extends the repayment by 6 weeks with a higher monthly figure. The third extends it further, but adds a collateral note on the north pasture, which I wouldn't recommend unless he refuses the first 2. Why not the third? Because you'd be giving him leverage on your best grazing land. The cattle recovery has to happen on that pasture, or it's slower and more expensive. You don't want Marsh holding paper on land you need to work. William was quiet for a moment. You thought of that. Somebody had to, Emma said. He looked at her steadily. I've had lawyers who thought less carefully than this. Lawyers charge more than $50 a month, Emma said. So that's either a compliment or an argument for a raise. The corner of his mouth moved. She was getting to know that motion, the almost smile that was William Carter's version of genuine amusement. It appeared rarely enough that she had started noticing when it happened, which was itself a thing she was trying not to notice too closely. I'll ride to town Monday, he said. Will you come? She looked up. To meet with Marsh. You know these numbers better than I do, he said. It was simple. It was true. He said it without any apparent awareness that it was an unusual thing for a man of his position, in 1898, to say to a woman he employed. Yes, Emma said. I'll come. They rode to Red Hollow on Monday morning, and Emma felt the town's attention before they even reached the main street. It was the particular quality of stillness that a small town gets when something interesting is happening. Everyone suddenly needing to be near a window or stepping out to check something across the street at exactly the moment you pass. She sat straight on the wagon seat and looked forward and did not acknowledge any of it. William noticed. She knew he noticed because she had learned to read the slight changes in the set of his shoulders. He said nothing, which was the right thing to do, and they continued down the main street at the same unhurried pace. Gerald Marsh received them in his office with the careful courtesy he gave to all of William's business, but Emma saw him register her presence, the slight adjustment of his expression, the question behind his eyes about what exactly she was doing here on the landowner's side of the desk. She answered the question by taking out the schedule before William could speak. Mr. Marsh, she said, I manage the Carter Ranch accounts. I've prepared 3 repayment scenarios for the note that's coming due. I'd like to walk you through the primary proposal first, and then we can discuss alternatives if needed. Gerald Marsh looked at William. William said nothing. He sat back. He let her work. It was, Emma would think later, one of the most significant things he had ever done for her. Not because she needed his permission to speak, she'd have spoken regardless, but because his silence was not passive. It was an active statement visible to Gerald Marsh and anyone else who might wonder, she speaks for this operation. Treat her accordingly. Marsh treated her accordingly. He was too professional not to, and he was also, Emma suspected, genuinely interested in what she'd brought, because the schedule she set in front of him was better than anything he'd expected, and his face showed it before he could rearrange it. They negotiated for 40 minutes. Emma held the primary timeline through the first pushback yielded 1 week on the secondary proposal, when Marsh offered a reduced interest adjustment in exchange and had a signed extension agreement on the table by noon. When they walked out onto the street, William stopped on the boardwalk. He turned and looked at her. That was, he said, and then stopped. Seemed to understand that whatever word he chose was going to be inadequate. It was 40 minutes, Emma said, and we got what we needed. Emma. Her first name again. He said it the way her father used to say it, like it was a complete sentence. I have been doing business in this county for 15 years. I have never watched anyone handle Gerald Marsh that well. She looked at him on the boardwalk in the thin autumn sun. This man who kept saying true things to her in the plain, direct way of someone who had forgotten that true things weren't always said, and she felt something in her chest press against its own edges like it was running out of room. "We should get lunch," she said, "before the ride back." He blinked. Then he nodded. "Yes," he said. "We should." They ate at the only decent restaurant in Red Hollow, which was Adeline Morrow's dining room, now open for midday meals on weekdays. Adeline brought the food herself and sat with them for 3 minutes while she caught Emma up on what had happened in the 2 weeks since she'd left, which was a way of seeing for herself what was happening between the woman she'd made lopsided cake for and the quiet rancher sitting across from her. Emma watched Adeline watching William, and watched William be entirely unaware he was being assessed, and thought with a complicated private feeling that Adeline Morrow was going to have opinions, and was going to express them the next time Emma came to town without William. She was right, but that was later. On the ride back, something had shifted between them, the way things shift after two people successfully do something hard together. The silence was the same, both of them comfortable in it, but it had a different quality. Less the silence of two people being careful, more the silence of two people who didn't need to be. "Can I ask you something?" Emma said when they were far enough from town that the question felt private. "Yes," William said. "Margaret." She paused, made sure she wanted to ask it. Did she know about the note, the financial pressure? I was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "She knew some of it," he said. "Not all. I protected her from some of it. The way you do." "The way you do when you don't want them to worry," Emma said. "Or the way you do when you're not sure they can handle it." He glanced at her sharply. "The first one." "All right," Emma said. She looked at the road ahead. "I don't need protecting from the financial reality of this operation," she said. "The more I know, the more useful I can be. I'm telling you that for practical reasons, not personal ones." "I understand," he said. "Good." She settled back on the seat. "And Mr. Carter?" "Yes. If the pressure gets worse before it gets better, you tell me. Don't manage it alone, and then come to me when it's already a crisis. We'll solve more if I have time to work with." He was quiet again. Then, "That's what she used to say, Margaret." His voice was even. "She used to say I handled things alone until they were emergencies, and then expected help without having built any." Emma heard the weight in that and was careful with it. "She was right," she said gently. "She usually was," he said. They rode on, and Emma thought that grief was a complicated kind of living in it, and that she was going to have to be very careful about what she let herself feel, because there was a significant difference between being useful to someone and being necessary to them, and an even more significant difference between being necessary and being loved. She was going to have to be careful. She already suspected she wasn't going to be careful enough. November came in cold and demanding the way Montana Novembers did, and the ranch settled into its winter rhythm. The cattle were moved. The barn was prepared. Emma laid in the root cellar stores with the systematic thoroughness she brought to everything. And by the 3rd week of the month, she had the house running with an efficiency that Hector told her in his spare way was the best it had been in years. Owen told her the same thing in approximately 800 more words. Tom Aldrich said nothing. But on a Tuesday morning, he set a split piece of firewood on the kitchen step without being asked, and then again on Wednesday. And Emma understood this as the particular language of a man who expressed approval through doing rather than saying, and she accepted it in the same language by leaving a plate of good cornbread on the step in return. And they had an entire friendship that never required either of them to speak about it. It was the middle of November when the trouble with the Larson brothers started. She heard about it first from Owen, who had the young man's habit of not knowing which information was important enough to lead with. He came into the kitchen on a Thursday afternoon, talking about a fence line and a disputed pasture and 3 brothers from 2 properties over. And it took Emma 3 minutes of listening to understand that what she was actually hearing about was a serious property dispute that had the potential to become significantly worse than a fence line argument. "Where's Mr. Carter?" she asked. "Rode out to the east pasture with Hector," Owen said. "The Larson boys were out there this morning. Words got said." "What kind of words?" Owen's jaw tightened. "The kind that usually come before somebody does something stupid." Emma untied her apron. Go find Hector, she said. Tell him to come back to the house. Tell him I said so. Owen blinked. Mr. Carter's not. Go find Hector, Emma said again, pleasantly and absolutely. Now please. Owen went. She had coffee ready, and the kitchen table cleared by the time William came through the door. Hector behind him, and she could see from the set of William's shoulders that whatever had happened at the east pasture had shaken something in him. Not physically, he wasn't that kind of man, but there was a tightness to him that hadn't been there this morning. He sat down. He took the coffee she set in front of him. He looked at the table for a moment like he was putting something in order internally. The Larsons are claiming 60 feet of the east fence line belongs to their property, he said, based on a survey they apparently commissioned last month. Do you have the original survey? Emma asked. I have it, somewhere. Margaret filed the land documents. He stopped. I'll find it, Emma said. Emma, I'll find it, she said again. She was already moving toward the hallway where she'd seen a cabinet she'd organized in the first week, but not gone through fully the one she'd earmarked as the property documents cabinet, because it had a lock and things with locks usually held things worth protecting. Is the survey dated and witnessed? It should be, William said from the kitchen. It was done by the county office when I bought the East land 18 years ago. She found it in 12 minutes. A folded document with official stamps dated August 1880, surveyed by the county office, and witnessed by two parties with a clear measurement of the east property line that matched William's fence exactly and contradicted the Larson claim by 63 feet. She brought it back to the kitchen and set it on the table in front of William. He unfolded it. He read it. Something left his face the tightness, the controlled down alarm. He looked up at her. Where did you find this? Cabinet in the hallway, third drawer. He stared at her for a moment. I've been looking for this document for 2 years, he said. I needed it for the Marsh extension paperwork in 2896, and I couldn't find it. 2 years ago, it might have been harder to find, Emma said. The cabinet wasn't organized. He looked at the document in his hands. Then he looked at her. What would I do without you? He said. He said it the way a person says a thing when they don't mean for it to come out as significant as it is. Simply honestly, not as a question, but as a thought that arrived at his mouth before he could decide whether to say it. Emma stood at the kitchen table and felt the sentence go through her like a cold current. You'd manage, she said. She kept her voice brisk and practical. But you'd spend more time looking for things. Hector, who had been leaning quietly against the doorframe, made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh and suddenly found something to look at in the other direction. William noticed none of it. He was already looking at the document again, his mind on the Larsons and the fence line and the practical next steps. I'll take this to Aldridge tomorrow, he said, and I'll write to the county surveyor's office to confirm. Take a copy, Emma said. Keep the original here, right? He stood. He picked up his coffee. He paused at the door between the kitchen and the hall. Thank you, he said. It's my job, Emma said. He nodded. He went. She stood at the table for a moment after he was gone, looking at the space he'd occupied. What would I do without you? She picked up the coffee cups and took them to the basin and washed them with great attention to what she was doing, and told herself firmly and clearly that she was a practical woman with practical priorities and an employment contract, and that a man saying, "What would I do without you?" while holding a land survey document was not by any reasonable measure a declaration of anything. She was practical. She was clear-eyed. She was absolutely right. She washed the cups twice. The Larson trouble resolved itself within 10 days. The county document was definitive. Sheriff Aldridge confirmed the boundary, and the three brothers backed down from their claim with the graceless retreat of men who'd hoped their bluff wouldn't be called. It left a particular tension in the air between the Carter Ranch and the neighboring property that wouldn't go away quickly, but the immediate crisis was done. What it left behind was something Emma hadn't expected. She hadn't expected William to start talking. Not about the ranch, not about logistics or cattle counts or supply orders. They talked about those things constantly and fluently, the shared language of the operation they were running together. She meant talking about other things, the kind of things people talked about when they were no longer being careful. It started small. On a Sunday evening in late November, he came into the kitchen while she was reading. She had Sundays at the house, now had stopped making the ride into Red Hollow to sit at her father's empty table because the ranch had started feeling like the place she came back to rather than the place she left from, and she wasn't sure what to do with that. And he sat across from her and said out of nowhere, "My father wanted me to be a lawyer." Emma looked up from her book. "I was going to be," he said. "I spent a year in Denver at a school. Then I came back to Wyoming for the summer to help my mother, and the ranch next door was selling, and I looked at that land and I just—" He stopped. "I knew," he said. "The way you know some things. I sent the school a letter, and I bought the land, and my father didn't speak to me for a year." "Did he come around?" Emma asked. "Eventually. He died before he ever came out to see what I'd built, though." He looked at his hands on their table. "I've always wondered whether he would have understood it if he'd seen it." "He would have," Emma said. "You build things that last. Anyone can see that." He looked at her. "How would you know that you've only been here 2 months?" "The root cellar repair," she said. "When you fixed it correctly, not conveniently. You used the right materials, even though they cost more and took longer. People who build things that last do it the same way, whether anyone's watching or not." William was quiet. The expression on his face was the one she'd been seeing more often lately, the one that meant she'd said something he hadn't expected and hadn't had time to put a barrier in front of. "Your father," he said. "Tell me about him." So she did. She told him about Daniel Whitmore, and the crooked shelf, and the too big laugh, and the hands that were always rough from work. She told him about the scaffold and the October morning and the banker's desk with the neat handwriting. She told him things she hadn't told anyone, not because she'd been hiding them, but because no one had asked. William listened the way he did everything completely, without interruption, without looking away. When she finished, he said, "He raised someone extraordinary. I hope he knew that." Emma pressed her lips together for a moment. "I think he did," she said when she trusted her voice. "He wasn't a man who said much, but he looked at me like I was worth something. That counts more than words." "Yes," William said. "It does." They sat in the kitchen with the fire and the quiet, and it was the most natural thing in the world, and also the most dangerous. And Emma thought that she had been very precise in her ledgers, and very organized in her pantry, and very clear-eyed about her financial goals, and she was not being any of those things right now. She was sitting in a kitchen with a man who listened like she was worth listening to, and she was in serious trouble. December arrived, and with it the particular stillness of a ranch under winter, and also without announcement, without anyone planning it, a shift in the daily pattern of the house that Emma noticed but did not name. William had taken to working in the evenings in the main room rather than the barn office. She had always worked in the kitchen in the evenings. The kitchen and the main room shared a doorway with no door in it, which meant that working in those 2 rooms in the evenings was functionally working in the same space. Neither of them commented on this. Owen noticed and said to Hector something that Emma couldn't hear, but that made Hector tell him quietly to mind his work, and that was the end of that conversation. But the look on Owen's face when he glanced at Emma the next morning was the look of a 21-year-old who has figured something out and is trying very hard to be mature about it. Emma gave him the look of a woman who would very much like him to continue trying. What she did not expect, what she was not prepared for, was Clara Walsh. Clara Walsh arrived on a Wednesday in the 2nd week of December, unannounced in a buggy driven by her brother, wearing a dark green traveling dress that fit her in the way that only certain women's clothes fit, which was to say, perfectly and deliberately. She was 32, widowed 2 years prior, the daughter of a successful Billings merchant, and she was— Emma could see this, the moment the woman stepped into the house, exactly the kind of woman the county expected William Carter to eventually marry. She was beautiful. She was polished. She was gracious in a way that had been practiced until it felt natural. And she looked at Emma when William introduced her as the ranch manager with the particular careful look of a woman assessing a situation she hadn't anticipated. "How lovely," Clara said, "that you found someone so capable." The inflection was impeccable. She said it like a compliment. It wasn't a compliment. Emma said, "Lovely to meet you, Mrs. Walsh." and meant it as a plain sentence and nothing else, because she was not going to do that with this woman. She was not going to engage in the particular choreography of competitive implication, because that was not who she was. William seemed unaware of the subtext. He offered Clara coffee and showed her to the main room, and spoke to her with the politeness of a man receiving a neighbor he was not displeased to see but had not planned his day around. Emma went back to the kitchen. She made the coffee. She brought it. She excused herself with perfect professionalism. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the work table and organized things that were already organized. Clara stayed for 2 hours. Emma heard the conversation in pieces. Clara asking about the ranch. William answering briefly. Clara shifting the conversation toward Billings and her father's business and mutual acquaintances and events that had happened in the county since William had withdrawn from socializing. She was skilled. She was doing what women in her position were taught to do, making herself visible, making herself relevant, reminding a man that she existed and that her existence was pleasant. Emma chopped 3 things that didn't need chopping. When William showed Clara to the door, Emma heard him say, "It was good of you to come, Clara. Give my regards to your brother." Polite, warm, nothing more. The buggy drove away. William came back to the kitchen. He looked at the quantity of things Emma had prepared in the last 2 hours, which was significantly more than usual, and he said nothing about that, which was the right decision. "She'll come back," Emma said without looking up from what she was doing. She wasn't sure why she said it. It was true, and she was a direct person, and those were her only reasons. "Probably," William said. He poured himself coffee from the pot. He leaned against the counter. "Does that bother you?" Emma looked up. He was watching her with the gray eyes that she had stopped being able to read as clearly as she had in the first weeks, because they'd gotten too familiar. Or she'd gotten too close. "It's your house," she said carefully. "Your life." "That's not what I asked," he said. The kitchen was very quiet. The fire settled in the stove. Emma held his gaze for 3 seconds, 5-7, long enough that the quality of the silence changed into something that required one of them to address it, or both of them to pretend it hadn't happened. "Mr. Carter," she said. Her voice was even. She made sure of that. "I am your employee. I manage your house well, and I intend to continue doing so. What happens in your personal life is, Emma. Not something that—" "Emma," he said again quietly. "Stop." She stopped. He set his coffee down. He looked at her across the kitchen with the directness she had always valued from him, and which she currently found absolutely terrifying. "I'm going to say something," he said. "And I'm going to say it plainly, because that's the only way I know how to say things. And when I've said it, you can tell me I've misread everything, and I will accept that, and nothing between us needs to change." Emma's heart was doing the thing it had been doing since the night with the ledger, but louder now, more emphatic. "All right," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Clara Walsh is a fine woman, and I have no feelings for her. The reason she coming back would or wouldn't bother you matters to me, because you matter to me. Not as my employee. Not as the most capable person I have ever had the privilege of working with, though you are that. As—" He stopped. His jaw was tight in the way it got when he was choosing words that cost him something. "As the person I look for when I come back to this house. As the person whose opinion I want before I make a decision about anything that matters. As the person who made me realize that I had been living inside my grief long enough that I had forgotten what it felt like to want to be somewhere." The kitchen was absolutely still. Emma looked at William Carter across the work table, this man who didn't make speeches and had just made one, and felt something enormous and terrifying and necessary shift inside her chest. "I have an employment contract," she said. "I know," he said. "With 6 months probationary period and 2 weeks notice and $50 a month." "I know what it says," he said. "I helped draft it. And you're my employer. I'm aware." He didn't look away. "I'm not asking you to change anything right now. I'm not asking you to feel something you don't feel. I'm telling you how it is on my side because you've told me to be straight with you, and I'm being straight with you." Emma set down what she was holding. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had looked past every surface and seen her clearly, who had sat across a kitchen table with her, and learned her father's name, and listened like she was worth listening to, who had said, "What would I do without you?" with a land survey in his hands, and meant more by it than either of them had been ready to address. "I'm not a woman who says things she's not certain of," she said. "I know that," he said, "so I'm not going to say what I might want to say until I've been certain of it long enough to trust it." He nodded, slowly, without pressure. "That's fair." "But," Emma said and stopped. "But," he said. "But it doesn't not bother me," she said. "Clara Walsh, coming back." She held his gaze. "That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm certain enough to say right now." Something changed in William Carter's face. Not the almost smile. Something deeper than that. Something that looked like a man who had been cold for a long time, standing in the first real warmth, and not quite knowing how to hold it yet. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." Emma picked up what she'd set down. "Supper will be ready at 6, she said. "Yes," he said. He picked up his coffee and went back to the main room. Emma stood at the work table and looked at the wall and thought that she had spent 26 years in the cold, not the Montana kind, though there had been plenty of that too, but the cold that came from being unseen, uncounted, unvalued, from working in the dark and sleeping in brief snatches and carrying weight that was never going to get any lighter. She thought about what it might mean, genuinely mean, in the physical reality of her daily life to be warm. She picked up her knife and got back to work. But she was smiling. Quietly, privately turned away from the doorway so no one could see it. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Emma Whitmore was smiling for no practical reason at all. And it was, she thought, a very good feeling. The smile didn't last the week. Not because anything went wrong between them. If anything, the days after William's declaration in the kitchen had a different quality. A new ease, like two people who had been carrying a weight they hadn't named and had finally set it down. He didn't press her. She didn't pull back. They worked together the way they had always worked, except that now there was something acknowledged underneath it, something that didn't need to be spoken every day to be real. But the smile didn't last the week, because on Friday morning, a letter arrived from Red Hollow. Hector brought it back from the supply run, along with the regular provisions, and he handed it to Emma without comment, but she saw him notice the return address. Gerald Marsh, Red Hollow Savings and Trust. And she saw him decide not to say anything about it, which told her that Hector had formed his own opinion about what letters from Gerald Marsh might mean to Emma's plans. She opened it in the kitchen alone, while the coffee was boiling. It was not about the ranch note. That had been settled. This was about her father's debt, or rather about a complication in her father's debt that she had not known existed. She read the letter twice, then she sat down. Gerald Marsh had written to inform her that in reviewing the original loan documents prompted, he said, by her recent visit, and the quality of the financial presentation she had made, he had discovered a secondary lien on the Whitmore property. A lien placed by her father 4 years before his death, which predated the main note, and which had been, through what Marsh described in careful banker's language, as an administrative oversight, never included in the accounting she had been working from. The secondary lien was $87. Emma stared at the number. She had $220 remaining on the main note. She had been working against that number for 4 years, had paid $260 toward it, had sacrificed sleep and health and the entirety of her social existence to get to a place where the end was visible. And now, without warning, without any fault of her own, the end had moved. $307. That was what remained. The coffee boiled over. She stood up and moved it off the heat and stood at the stove with her back to the room and breathed carefully until she trusted herself. Then she sat back down and read the letter a third time, looking for anything she had missed, any ambiguity in the language, any possibility that she had misunderstood. She hadn't. Gerald Marsh was a precise man, and his language was precise. The lien was real. The amount was correct. It was hers to pay. She folded the letter. She put it in her apron pocket. She poured the coffee. She did not tell William. Not that morning, not that evening, not that weekend. She went about her work with the same efficiency she brought to everything, and she sat across from him in the evenings and talked about the ranch and the winter operations and the plans for the spring garden. And she did not tell him, because the moment she told him he would offer to help, and she could not let him help, and she needed to work that out in her own mind before she had to say it to his face. She needed to be sure of herself. She had told him she was not a woman who said things she wasn't certain of, and that applied to everything, not just to the soft and terrifying things she was beginning to feel. She was not going to become someone who needed rescuing. Not after 4 years of being her own rescue. It was Owen who noticed first, because Owen noticed everything emotional and nothing practical, which was the inverse of Hector, and made the two of them together a nearly complete person. On Sunday afternoon, when Emma was in the kitchen doing her weekly accounts, Owen came in on the pretext of getting water and stayed on the pretext of being 21 and having no ability to leave a room where something was clearly wrong. "You've been quiet," he said. "I'm always quiet on Sundays," Emma said without looking up. "You've been a different kind of quiet," Owen said. "The kind where something's bothering you and you're deciding whether it's going to keep bothering you or whether you're going to do something about it." Emma looked up. Owen was leaning against the counter with his water cup, looking at her with the expression of a young man who was more perceptive than he was usually given credit for. "That's remarkably specific," she said. "My mother had the same quiet," he said simply. "When things got hard and she was deciding." Emma looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at her ledger. "I got some news from town this week," she said. "About my father's property. There's more owed than I knew." "How much more?" "Enough to change my timeline." Owen was quiet for a moment. "You should tell Mr. Carter," he said. "That's not your business, Owen." "No, ma'am," he said. "But I've watched that man for 2 years, living like someone turned the lights down, and I've watched him for 2 months since you got here, living like someone turned them back up, and I think—" He stopped, regrouped. "I think people who care about each other tell each other things. That's all I'm saying." Emma set her pencil down very deliberately. "Owen Briggs," she said, "you are 21 years old." "Yes, ma'am." "And you are giving me advice about telling a man the truth," Owen said, and his voice had a simplicity that made it impossible to argue with without arguing against something she actually believed. "Which I know you value. So." He put his water cup down and walked out, and Emma sat in the kitchen and looked at the wall and thought that sometimes the least likely person said the most necessary thing. She told William that evening. She waited until after supper, until Hector and Tom and Owen had gone to their quarters, until the kitchen was clean, and she had run out of reasons to delay. She came to the doorway between the kitchen and the main room where William was working at his desk, and she said his name. He looked up immediately. He always looked up immediately when she said his name, which was something she had noticed and was carefully not thinking about. "Can I talk to you?" she said. "Always," he said. She came and sat across from him. She put the letter on the desk between them. He read it. She watched his face while he read it, watched him track the numbers, understand the implication, arrive at the same place she had arrived at 3 days ago. He set the letter down. "Emma," he said. "Don't," she said. She said it quietly and without heat, but she said it clearly. "I know what you're going to say. I need you to hear me first." He closed his mouth. He waited. "I have been paying this debt for 4 years," she said. "It's the thing that has organized my entire adult life. It's the reason I took 3 jobs and got 4 hours of sleep and stayed in a town that treated me like furniture. It is the last thing I have left to do for my father, and I need to do it myself." She held his gaze. "I'm not being stubborn. I'm not refusing help to prove something. I'm telling you that if I let someone else pay this, it will no longer be mine, and it has to be mine. Do you understand that?" William looked at her for a long time. She watched him work through it, the practical part of him that wanted to solve the problem, the part that had been listening to her for 2 months and understood what she was telling him. "I understand," he said. "I don't like it, but I understand it." "Thank you," she said. "What does this do to your timeline?" "It adds approximately 4 months," she said, "at current savings rate." "So close to a year from now." "Yes," he nodded. His jaw was tight. Not with disagreement, with the effort of not arguing against something he'd already said he understood. And during that year, he said carefully, your salary continues, your position continues, everything continues, exactly as it has been. Yes, she said. That's the arrangement we agreed to. He was quiet. Then he said, and when the debt is paid? Emma looked at him across the desk. This question was not about the debt. They both knew it was not about the debt. When the debt is paid, she said, choosing her words with the same precision she gave to the repayment schedules she wrote for Gerald Marsh. I will be a free woman. No obligations I haven't chosen. No weight I'm carrying because I have to. She paused. I want to make choices from that place, not from a place where I'm still working off something. William's eyes were very steady on her. You're talking about more than the debt, he said. Yes, she said. You're talking about us, he said. I'm talking about my ability to come to anything between us honestly, she said, without owing you, without depending on you, without any possibility that what I feel has been shaped by circumstance. He was very still. You're asking me to wait, he said. I'm asking you to understand why I need to do this first, she said. Those aren't the same thing. The fire settled in the hearth. The wind moved outside, and the house held it out the way solid things held out weather. I've waited 4 years already, he said quietly. And then seeing her expression, he clarified, not for you specifically, for any reason to believe that my life was going to have something in it again, besides work and memory. He looked at the desk. A year is not a long time. Emma let out a breath she had been holding since Friday morning. No, she said. It's not. Then we keep working, he said. We keep working, she agreed. He picked up the letter, folded it, held it out to her. She took it. Their fingers were close but didn't touch, and that not touching had a weight to it, like an entire conversation in the space of a half-inch. She went back to the kitchen. She put the letter in her ledger. She sat at the table and looked at the new numbers and rebuilt her timeline with the careful, practiced patience of a woman who had been doing this for 4 years and knew that the only way through a hard thing was straight through it. It was going to be all right. She was certain of it, in the way she was certain of very few things. Not hopefully, not wishfully, but with the bone-deep conviction of a person who had looked at a hard road and recognized that she had already walked harder ones. January came in brutal. The kind of cold that made the world contract to the distance between one heated room and the next, and the Carter Ranch pulled together the way isolated places do in hard weather, closer, more dependent, more honest. Tom Aldrich spoke to Emma for the first time in January. Not the language of firewood and cornbread, but actual words on a Wednesday morning when she was repairing a split in the barn door frame because it needed doing, and she was there, and it wasn't complicated. He appeared beside her, looked at what she was doing and said, "You're holding the plane wrong." Emma looked at the plane. She looked at Tom. "Show me," she said. He showed her. They worked on the doorframe for 40 minutes without speaking much, and at the end of it Tom said, "You do good work," and walked away. And Emma understood that she had just been given something significant by a man who did not give it easily. She told Hector about it at lunch, and Hector smiled for the first time she'd ever seen him smile, a small, true smile that changed his whole face. "Tom doesn't say that to many people," he said. "I know," Emma said. "I won't forget it." It was also in January that Clara Walsh came back. Emma had predicted it, and she had been right. But being right about a thing did not make the thing more comfortable. Clara arrived on a Saturday again, in the buggy again, with her brother, and this time she had brought a covered dish, something she'd made herself, she explained with a modest self-deprecation that was perfectly calibrated, and she was wearing blue, which was a very deliberate choice by a woman who understood that she looked well in blue. Emma opened the door because Emma always answered the door. Clara's eyes went to her held for one beat, and then Clara smiled the smile of a woman who had decided to be gracious about something she was not gracious about. "Miss Whitmore, how are you finding ranch life?" "Very well, thank you," Emma said. "Please come in." She showed them to the main room. She told William he had guests, and then she went to the kitchen and made coffee and a plate of good things, because that was her job, and she did her job regardless of her feelings about who she was doing it for. She could hear Clara's voice through the doorway, lighter than her natural register, animated in the way women got animated when they were performing rather than just talking. She could hear William's responses brief and consistent, the same tone he used with Dale Hennessy and the county surveyor and every other person he was polite to but not interested in. She knew his voice by now, all its registers. She knew the voice he used when he was being patient, and the voice he used when he was engaged, and the voice he used in the evenings when they were talking, and he'd said something he hadn't planned to say and surprised himself with it. He wasn't using any of those voices with Clara Walsh. He was using the neighbor voice. Warm enough to be decent, flat enough to be truthful. Emma put good biscuits on the plate. She was not going to feel triumphant about this. That was not who she was. She was, however, a human woman, and she felt what she felt, and she decided that feeling it quietly and privately, and then getting on with her afternoon was the correct response. Clara stayed 90 minutes. When she left, William came directly to the kitchen in the way he had started doing when something happened that he wanted to talk to Emma about. And Emma thought that this reflex of his, this turning toward her, was one of the things she had been most careful not to let herself love, and was also one of the things she loved most. He sat down. She poured coffee. He wrapped both hands around the cup. "She's going to keep coming," he said. "I told you that in December," Emma said. "I know." He looked at the cup. "I don't want to be unkind to her. She hasn't done anything wrong." "No," Emma said. "She hasn't. But I also don't want to let the visits continue in a way that gives her an impression that isn't—" He stopped. "Accurate," Emma supplied. "Yes." He looked up. "What do I say to her without being unkind?" Emma thought about this. She appreciated that he asked. She appreciated even more that he asked her specifically, because it would have been easier to navigate Clara Walsh's feelings without consulting the person who had the clearest interest in the outcome. "The truth is usually kindest in the long run," Emma said. "You tell her that your attention is committed in another direction. You don't have to be specific. She'll understand what you mean. And if she asks to be specific—" Emma looked at him steadily. "Then you be specific." He held her gaze. "All right," he said. "She'll be hurt for a while," Emma said. "And then she won't be. She's not a foolish woman. She'll find her way." William nodded. He drank his coffee. After a moment, he said quietly, "Thank you for not making this harder than it needed to be." Emma raised her eyebrows. "For not making it harder. You could have," he said simply. "You could have been cold to her, or made things awkward, or some women would have. You didn't. You were kind and professional, and you made good biscuits." Emma thought about the 2 minutes she had spent feeling something that was not quite triumphant about the biscuits, and decided that was not information she needed to share. "I told you in October," she said. "I'm not the type who complicates things that ought to be simple." He smiled. Not the corner of the mouth almost smile. An actual smile, full and real, and Emma looked at it and thought that this was the thing about loving someone, and she was honest with herself. Now she did not flinch from the word. The thing about it was that their smile became a specific thing you looked forward to in a way that was completely irrational and entirely beyond your control. She picked up her coffee and looked at the table. "Spring in 3 months," she said. 3 months, he agreed. "I want to start the garden as soon as the ground's workable." "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about that." "You've been thinking about my garden." "I've been thinking about expanding the south side of the property to give you more room," he said, "if you want it." Emma looked at him. "That would require—" "I know what it would require," he said. "I've already checked with Aldridge about the boundary adjustment. It's straightforward." He paused. "Margaret's garden was good, but it was small. You think bigger than small, Emma." She held his gaze. There was a version of this moment where she deflected it, where she said something practical about soil quality, or growing seasons, or the logistics of a larger garden. She knew how to do that. She'd been doing it for months, turning the warm and significant things into practical ones, because that was safer, and she wasn't ready. She was beginning to think she was getting ready. "Thank you," she said. "Not practically. Just that." "You're welcome," he said. Just that. February brought a crisis that had nothing to do with finances or property lines or the heart. Tom Aldrich got hurt. It was a fence repair, gone wrong, a wire snap that caught him across the forearm at force, a deep gash that Hector packed with what they had and brought Tom in from the field on a horse. Tom white in the face and silent in the deliberate way of a man refusing to make a sound about pain. Emma had the kitchen cleared and her medical kit out before they were through the door, because she had anticipated this kind of emergency, the way she anticipated most things, by learning what could go wrong and preparing before it did. "Sit him here," she said. "Hector, more water. Owen, get the lamp closer." Tom sat in the kitchen chair and looked at his arm, and then looked at Emma with the expression of a man who was deciding whether to trust someone with something important. It was the same expression he'd had in the barn before he'd shown her how to hold the plane. "It's going to need to be cleaned properly," Emma said. She met his eyes. "And it's going to hurt. I'll be as quick as I can." Tom nodded once. "Do it right," he said. "Don't worry about fast." She did it right. He made one sound, a single short intake of breath when she cleaned the deepest part, and then nothing. She worked with the focused efficiency she brought to everything, and when it was done and dressed properly, she sat back and looked at her work with the critical eye of someone who had learned field medicine from a book and emergency practice, and was never entirely confident, but was always thorough. "You'll need to keep it clean," she said. "Change the dressing every morning. Come to me before you go out, and after you come in until it's closed." "Yes, ma'am," Tom said. He was looking at his arm with something that might have been grudging respect. "And Tom?" Emma said. He looked at her. "You did good out there. Hector said you finished securing the wire before you came in." Tom's jaw shifted. "Wasn't going to leave it open for the cattle," he said. "I know," Emma said. "That's what I mean." William had been in the doorway through all of it. She had registered him there, without looking directly, had been aware of him, the way she was always aware of him in a room, and when she came out of the kitchen to wash her hands, he was in the hallway, and they almost collided. He put his hands on her arms to steady her. It was reflex practical over in 2 seconds. But it was the first time he had touched her with both hands, and neither of them moved immediately after. "He's all right," Emma said. Her voice was steady. "I know," William said. "I could see." His hands dropped. How did you know what to do?" "I've been the only person responsible for my own health for 4 years," Emma said. "You learn." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between admiration and a very specific kind of pain. The pain of someone realizing what another person has had to carry alone. "You shouldn't have had to," he said. "No," Emma agreed. "But I did. And now I know how to close a wound which comes in useful on a ranch." She stepped back gently. "I'm going to check on Tom again in an hour." "Emma," he said. She stopped. She turned. "I know we're waiting," he said. "I know you need to do this your way, and I respect that. I do." He looked at her steadily. "But I need you to know that what I said in December, it hasn't changed. It won't change in a year. This is not temporary for me." Emma looked at him in the hallway with the lamplight between them. "I know," she said softly. "I just needed to say it again," he said. "So you have it." "I have it," she said. She went back to the kitchen. She heard him go back to the main room, and she stood at the basin washing her hands and thought that there was a particular kind of love that came without conditions, without urgency, without the demand that you become something other than what you were, and that she had spent 26 years not knowing what it felt like, and 2 months learning, and that the learning of it was changing her in ways she was only beginning to understand. March arrived and the ground started thinking about spring. Emma watched it the way farmers watch the ground, with the particular attention of someone who knows that what's coming is worth preparing for. She wrote to Gerald Marsh twice in March, once to confirm the payment schedule and once to tell him she would be accelerating the schedule, because in February she had made a discovery in the Carter Ranch accounts that had produced an unexpected surplus. A billing error from a supplier, an overcharge from 2 years back that she had spotted while reconciling old records, which when she contacted the supplier and produced her documentation, resulted in a credit of $43. $43. She put every cent of it toward the Whitmore debt. She told William about the billing error because it was his money and he deserved to know, and he looked at her across the kitchen table with the expression she was most familiar with by now. The one that meant she had done something that continued to exceed his expectations, and he said, "2 years, Emma. That error was sitting there for 2 years." "Nobody was looking," she said. "Nobody was looking," he agreed. And then quietly, "I'm very glad you're looking." She wrote the $43 into her ledger and watched the number change, and felt the particular fierce satisfaction of a woman who was going to get there, who had always been going to get there, who had simply needed the right position to do it from. The debt now stood at $217. At her accelerated rate, she was looking at 8 months rather than 11. Possibly 7 if the garden produced what she thought it would, and she could supplement the household income with preserved goods and sales to the town. She was going to make it. She was certain. The twist came in April, and Emma would think later that she should have seen it coming, because nothing in her life had ever been simple, and there was no reason April should have been the exception. Clara Walsh came back one last time. Not in the buggy, not with her brother, not with a covered dish and a deliberate blue dress. She came on horseback alone on a Tuesday morning when William was in town, and Emma was working in the new garden space he had cleared on the south side, the one he'd expanded for her in March when the ground finally allowed it. Emma heard the horse and looked up. Clara dismounted with the ease of a woman who had ridden her whole life, and walked toward Emma with the directness of a woman who had made a decision and was keeping it. She stopped at the edge of the turned earth. "I'm not here to make trouble," she said. Emma straightened up. She held Clara's gaze without defensiveness. "I didn't think you were." Clara looked at her. Really looked at her. Not the surface of a room look she'd used on her visits in December, but the direct estimating look of a woman trying to understand something true. "He spoke to me," Clara said. "In February. He was kind. He was honest." She paused. "He told me his attention was committed elsewhere." "I know," Emma said. She did know. William had told her the same evening in the simple and direct way he told her everything. "I wanted to see for myself," Clara said, "what elsewhere looked like." Emma did not say anything. She stood in the garden space with her hands at her sides and let Clara look. "You're not what I expected," Clara said finally. I know what you expected," Emma said without sharpness. "You expected someone like you, polished, appropriate for his position." "Yes," Clara said. She had the grace to be honest about it. "And you're not. You're—" She stopped, seemed to search for the word that fit. "You're real, is the only way I can say it. You're the most real person I've seen him with since Margaret." Emma felt the weight of that. It landed somewhere important. "I was unkind to you in my head," Clara said. "When I thought about you, I was dismissive in ways I wouldn't have been if I'd been thinking of you as a person instead of an obstacle." She held Emma's gaze. "I'm sorry for that." Emma looked at Clara Walsh. This woman who had everything the world said should make a man want her, and who had come on horseback alone to apologize to a ranch manager. She'd never been cruel to out loud, and felt something open in her chest that had not been open before. "Thank you," Emma said. "That took something to say." "Yes," Clara said. "It did." She picked up her horse's reins. She looked at the turned earth of the garden. "What are you planting?" "Beans, tomatoes, herbs, corn along the east side." Emma paused. "Margaret planted the original garden. I'm going to keep some of what she had and add to it." Something passed across Clara's face. "She was a good woman," she said. "I know," Emma said. "I feel her in this house." Clara mounted her horse. She looked down at Emma with an expression that had shed every layer of performance and was just simply honest. "He's lucky," she said. "I hope he knows it." "He does," Emma said. Clara Walsh rode away and did not come back again. And Emma stood in the garden space and thought about what it cost a person to change their mind about someone, and thought that it was one of the bravest things people did, and thought that she respected Clara Walsh considerably more than she had expected to. She went back to work. May arrived golden and purposeful, and the garden went in and the ranch moved into its spring rhythm with an energy that everyone felt but no one talked about directly. Tom Aldrich's arm had healed clean. He set a split piece of firewood on the kitchen step every morning without fail. Emma left cornbread, occasionally biscuits. Once she left a small piece of apple pie, and the next morning there were 2 pieces of firewood instead of 1, which she took to mean he approved. Hector brought her coffee without being asked on a Thursday and said, "You're going to stay," not as a question. "Yes," Emma said, not as an answer to the question he'd technically asked. Hector nodded. "Good," he said, and went back to his work. Owen sat at dinner on a Friday, looking at the ceiling with the elaborate casualness of a man pretending to think of something spontaneously. "You know, this place feels different than when I got here 3 years ago. Better. Like it woke up." Nobody said anything. Owen looked at William. "No offense, sir." "None taken, Owen," William said, and this corner of his mouth moved. Emma looked at her plate. She was smiling, and she was not going to hide it completely, and she decided that was all right. It was the middle of May when William asked her to walk with him after supper. They did this sometimes, not often, but when the evenings were right. Walking the property, checking the fence line or the barn or the cattle, which was always the stated reason, and was sometimes even the real one. But this time, he walked her away from the working parts of the ranch and toward the north, toward the open ground, where there was nothing practical to check, and Emma walked beside him and knew they were going somewhere that had been decided before he asked. He stopped. She stopped beside him. He stood in the May evening and looked at the mountains the way he looked at them from the porch every morning with his coffee. And she looked at the mountains with him and waited. "I have something to ask you," he said. "Ask it," she said. He turned to look at her. In the evening light, his face was open in a way it almost never was. No containment, no careful management. Just the face of a man who had brought himself to a moment and was going to say the true thing. "I want to build a life with you," he said. "Not when the debt is paid. Not when circumstances are different. I want to start building it now, knowing the debt will be paid and the circumstances will come right, because those are practical problems, and we are both good at practical problems." He paused. "But more importantly, I want to ask you now, rather than later, because I have spent 4 years of my life waiting for the right moment to live it. And I think we both know that the right moment is the one you decide to claim." Emma stood beside him in the May evening. She thought about a kitchen table at 4 in the morning and a candle and a ledger full of numbers. She thought about a tray slammed down in a saloon and a man in a corner who said, "Go home, Cleet," without raising his voice. She thought about a contract written in her own handwriting and a handshake that treated her hand like the hand of a person. She thought about gray eyes and a root cellar and a land survey and $43 found in a 2-year-old billing error and a garden expanded so she could think bigger than small. She thought about her father and the crooked shelf and the hands that were always rough from work. She thought that he had raised someone who knew what it meant to fight for something. And she thought that she had been fighting her whole life, and that fighting towards something was different from fighting away from something, and that this man, this ranch, this life that was being offered to her by someone who saw her completely, was something she very much wanted to fight toward. She had $217 left to pay. She had 7 or 8 months of work ahead of her. She had a ledger and a plan, and the bone-deep discipline of a woman who finished what she started. But she was also 26 years old, and it was May, and the mountains were very beautiful in the evening light, and she was standing next to a man who had told her the truth every single time she'd asked for it. "I have conditions," she said. His face didn't change. "Name them." "The debt is mine to pay," she said. "You don't touch it. You don't find a creative way to solve it without telling me. You let me finish what I started." "Agreed," he said, without hesitation. "I want my name on the ranch accounts, not as your employee, as a partner in this operation." He looked at her steadily. "Also agreed." "And the garden is mine," she said. Something moved in his face, the real smile full and unhidden. "Emma," he said, "I expanded it for you in March." "I know," she said. "I'm establishing the principle." "The garden is yours," he said. "Everything in it. every square foot. She looked at him. She let herself look at him the way she had been careful not to, all the way from October to May, without the practical overlay, without the management of feeling. Just looking as herself at a man she loved. It was as simple and as enormous as that. "Yes," she said. William Carter looked at her across the May evening with everything in his face that he was no longer containing, and Emma Whitmore stood in the garden of her choosing and knew with the complete unshakable certainty that she reserved for very few things in her life that she had made the right decision. Not the brave one, not the practical one, not the careful one, the right one. He took her hand, not the firm, brief handshake of a business partner. Her hand held in both of his, the way you hold something you intend to keep. They stood in the evening light. And for the first time since she was 22 years old, Emma Whitmore did not count anything. Not dollars, not hours, not the distance between where she was and where she was trying to get. She just stood there. And it was enough. It was more than enough. The summer of 1899 moved the way. Summers moved on a working ranch fast in the body, slow in the memory, full of the kind of days you didn't appreciate until you were looking back at them from a distance. Emma paid Gerald Marsh $60 in June, $70 in July, because the garden had produced more than she'd planned, and she'd sold preserved tomatoes and herb bundles to Adeline Morrow and to 2 other families in town who had heard through the particular telegraph of small-town knowledge that the Carter Ranch manager put up preserves worth buying. She sat at the kitchen table on the last Sunday of July and ran the numbers and looked at what remained and felt the number. The way you feel something that's almost done with impatience and with a kind of reverence both at once. $87. She told William at supper. She didn't make an announcement of it. She simply said while passing the bread, 87 left on the Whitmore note. William looked at her across the table. Hector looked at his plate with the particular attention of a man giving 2 people their moment. Owen opened his mouth and then closed it, which was a level of self-restraint that Emma chose to acknowledge with a small nod in his direction. Tom set down his fork, looked at Emma and said, "Good." Then picked his fork back up. That was all. It was exactly right. That night, William came to the kitchen after the others had gone and sat across from her with his coffee and didn't say anything for a while, which was its own kind of conversation. Then he said, "How does it feel?" Emma thought about that. She thought about October and the tray she'd slammed down, and the 4:30 mornings, and the ledger by candlelight, and the number that had seemed at certain points in certain winters. Like a wall, she was going to spend her life running at without ever breaking through. "Like I can see the end of it," she said. "Like it's real." "It's real," he said. "I know," she said. "I just needed to say it out loud." He nodded. He understood that the need to make the true thing audible, to give it sound and air, to hear it in your own voice before you fully believed it. He was that kind of man. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his briefly, firmly, and then let go. $87, he said. "And then I'm going to ask Frank Hatcher if we can use his store for a wedding." Emma looked at him. "Frank will say yes before you finish the sentence." "I know," William said. "But I'll let him feel like he thought about it." She laughed, actually laughed the full kind, and he sat across from her with his coffee and watched her laugh with the expression of a man who was storing something away to look at later. And Emma thought that this kitchen, this man, this life was the thing she had been building toward without knowing it through every single dark morning and late night and number in a ledger. She went to bed that night and slept the way she always slept now, fully, deeply, without counting the hours, until she had to get up. August was when the twist came that nobody saw arriving, because it came from the direction nobody had been watching. It came from Cleet Burrow. He showed up at the Carter Ranch on a Wednesday morning without being invited, riding a horse that looked like it had been ridden hard, and he did not come to the barn or call from the road the way a person came when they expected to be welcome. He came directly to the kitchen door and knocked, and when Emma opened it, she felt the particular stillness that came over her in situations that required it. He looked worse than she remembered. Thinner through the face, less certain of himself, the particular deflation of a man whose loudness had been running on something that had run out. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His hat was in his hands. "Mr. Burrow," she said. She did not step aside. She was not going to make this easy for him by being easier than it needed to be, but she was also not going to be cruel. "What do you need?" He worked his hat in his hands for a moment. "I need to talk to you," he said, "if you'll allow it." She studied him for 3 seconds. Then she stepped aside. She did not offer him coffee immediately. She let him stand in the kitchen where he'd chosen to come, and she stood at the work table and waited. "My wife left me," he said. "January. Took the children to her sisters in Helena." He stopped. She said I'd spent 20 years making people feel small, to make myself feel big, and she wasn't going to watch me do it anymore." He looked at the hat in his hands. "She named you specifically Miss Whitmore. She said what I did to you in the saloon was the thing that showed her she'd been right to leave." Emma was very still. She thought about that October night in the Double Crown, the tray, the silence, the man in the corner who said, "Go home," without raising his voice. She thought about how that night had changed everything, though not in the way Cleet Burrow had intended when he opened his mouth. "Why are you here?" she said. Her voice was not unkind. It was honest. "Because I've been carrying this around since January, and I couldn't figure out who to answer to," he said. "I've done a lot of things I'm not proud of, a lot of them." He looked up at her. "But what I said to you in front of all those people, that was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I was doing it. I did it anyway because—" He stopped. "Because you couldn't do anything about it. Because nobody was going to stand up for you. And that's the worst kind of wrong there is, isn't it? When you do it because you know the other person has no protection." Emma looked at Cleet Burrow standing in her kitchen, holding his hat, and being honest for what she suspected was one of the first times he'd been honest with anyone in years, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. She felt sorry for him. Not in the way that dismissed what he'd done, but in the way that looked at a man who had spent his life being Cleet Burrow, and understood that nobody was only the worst thing they'd done, and that living inside your own worst self for long enough eventually became its own punishment. "Sit down, Mr. Burrow," she said. He sat. She made coffee. She put a cup in front of him and sat across from him and said, "Here is what I'm going to tell you. What you did that night, and the 100 other times you did versions of it to me and to other people, that was wrong. You're right about that. And your wife was right to name it. And I'm not going to tell you it didn't hurt, because it did. But I'm also not going to tell you that you're unredeemable, because I don't believe that about anyone who comes and sits in someone's kitchen and says the true thing out loud." She looked at him steadily. "Write to your wife. Don't tell her you've changed. Tell her what you told me, that you knew it was wrong and you did it anyway. That's the honest thing. She can decide what to do with that." Cleet looked at the coffee cup. Something in his face moved. "That's more than I deserved," he said. "Probably," Emma said. "Drink your coffee." He drank his coffee. He left 20 minutes later, and he shook her hand at the door and couldn't quite meet her eyes. And Emma thought that was all right. He had more work to do before he could meet anyone's eyes directly, and that work was his to do, and not hers to manage. William came in from the barn an hour later, and she told him who had been there and what had happened. He listened without interrupting, which was how he listened. "You gave him coffee," he said. "I gave him coffee," she agreed. "Emma Whitmore," he said with the specific tone he used when she had done something that expanded his existing understanding of her. "You are. Don't make it strange," she said. "I'm saying you're remarkable," he said. "I know what you're saying," she said. "Supper's at 6. He was smiling as he walked back to the barn, and she felt it even with her back turned. The letter she'd been waiting for arrived on the 4th of September. She knew what it was before she opened it. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. Now the steadiness that came from not being exhausted down to the bone, and she opened the envelope in the kitchen alone and unfolded the document inside. Paid in full. The Whitmore family note, principal and interest, including secondary lien, satisfied in its entirety. The property at Lot 14, Red Hollow Township, free and clear. Signed, Gerald Marsh, Red Hollow Savings and Trust, September 2, 1899. Emma read it once. She set it on the table. She sat down. She put her face in her hands. She didn't cry. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but lived somewhere between the two. The sound of something that has been held tight for so long that its release has its own texture. She sat in the kitchen of the Carter Ranch and let herself feel it. 4 years of 4:30 mornings and midnight saloon shifts and numbers in a ledger by candlelight. Let herself feel the full weight of what she'd carried and set down, because she had earned the right to feel it, and she was going to take it. 1 minute, maybe 2. Then she straightened up. She wiped her face with her apron. She picked up the document and walked to the barn. William was with Hector looking at something on the fence line map, and he looked up when she came in, the way he always looked up when she came in, and she held up the document without speaking. He looked at her face first, then at the document, then at her face again. He said her name, just her name, Emma, the way her father used to say it. She walked across the barn, and he met her halfway, and she put the document in his hand and said, "It's done." He looked at the paper. His jaw moved once. He looked back at her. "It's done," he said. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He pulled her toward him, not romantic, not tentative, but the way you pull someone close when you have been afraid they were carrying something too heavy, and you've just been told they set it down with relief, and with the particular fierce gratitude of a man who has been watching someone he loves fight a long battle and has just seen them win. She put her forehead against his shoulder for exactly 4 seconds. Then she stepped back. "I want to ride to town tomorrow," she said. "I want to see the house, my father's house, just once." "I'll take you," he said. "You don't have to." "Emma," he said. "I'll take you." Hector, who had been very absorbed in the fence line map, cleared his throat. "Congratulations, Miss Whitmore," he said without looking up. "Thank you, Hector," she said. She walked back to the kitchen. She had supper to make. She had always had supper to make, and she was going to make it with the same attention she brought to everything. And tonight it was going to be especially good because she was free, and she was happy, and the people sitting at her table had earned something good. She started cooking. She was smiling the whole time. They rode to Red Hollow the next morning, and Emma sat on the wagon seat beside William the way she had sat beside him on the first Thursday in October, almost a year ago, except that everything was different now, and also in the ways that mattered most, exactly the same. They went to Gerald Marsh first. He was expecting them. She had sent word the day before, and he received them in his office with something that looked on Gerald Marsh's carefully managed face like genuine pleasure. He shook her hand. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I want to say something before we get to the documents." He paused, which was unusual for a man who chose his words in advance. "When you first came to me about your father's note, I thought I believed privately that you would not sustain it. I thought you were brave to try, and I expected you to fail." He looked at her steadily. "I was wrong, and I think you should hear me say that directly." Emma looked at Gerald Marsh. "Thank you," she said. "That means something." "It should," he said. "You did something remarkable, and you did it without asking for any accommodation beyond time." He handed her the documents she needed for the property. She signed what needed signing. She folded what needed folding and put it in the inside pocket of her coat close to her chest, and she stood up and shook Gerald Marsh's hand one final time. "We'll be back," William said to Marsh from the chair beside hers. "We'll need to discuss the ranch expansion note next month. Miss Whitmore will be managing that conversation." Marsh looked at William, looked at Emma. "Of course," he said without a beat of hesitation. They walked out of the bank onto the main street of Red Hollow, and Emma stood on the boardwalk for a moment and looked at the town that had watched her work herself to nothing for 4 years, that had laughed at her behind her back and sometimes to her face, that had not known what to do with her, and so had mostly looked past her. The town looked the same. It always looked the same. That was what towns did. What was different was her. "Your father's house," William said beside her. "Yes," she said. They drove out of town on the North Road and turned west at the fork the way she had turned every Sunday for 4 years, and arrived at the small house she had worked to keep since she was 22 years old. She climbed down without waiting for help. She never waited for help unless she needed it, which was different from not accepting it, and walked to the door and opened it with the key she had kept on her person every single day since October of 1895. The house was cold. It had been closed for a year, but it was hers. The stove her father had built, the shelf he had put up crooked and never straightened. The window that looked east and caught the morning light in a way that was different from every other window she'd ever looked through. She stood in the middle of the room. William stood in the doorway. He didn't come in. He understood without being told that this was her room and her minute, and he was not needed for it. She stood in her father's house with the paid-in-full document in her coat pocket, and she said quietly to the room, to the crooked shelf, to the stove, and the eastern window, and all the years of hard mornings that this house represented, "I did it, Dad. I kept it." Then she turned and walked back to the door. William stepped aside to let her through. As she passed him, he said nothing. Just put his hand briefly at the small of her back there, and gone. The gesture of a man who understood what a moment meant, and knew that some things required touch rather than words. "Let's go home," she said. They drove back to the Carter Ranch in the September afternoon, and Emma sat on the wagon seat and looked at the mountains coming toward them as they headed north, and thought that she had left a town and arrived at a life, and that the distance between those two things was not measured in miles. Frank Hatcher said yes before William finished the sentence. The wedding was on the second Saturday of October, 1 year and 3 days after Emma Whitmore had slammed a tray down in the Double Crown Saloon and changed the direction of everything. The church in Red Hollow was small, and the congregation was not large. Neither of them was the kind of person who measured love by the size of its audience, but the people who came were the ones who mattered. Adeline Morrow, who wept in the emphatic way of a woman who had made a lopsided cake a year ago and had known even then how this would end. Roy Haskell, who had brought himself and a clean jacket, and who stood in the back pew and held his hat with both hands and looked like a man who had learned to say something when it needed to be said. Gerald Marsh, who sat in the third row with his wife and looked at Emma walking down the aisle with the expression of a man who was revising his understanding of the world and finding the revision welcome. Sheriff Aldridge, who sat straight-backed and dry-eyed and gave Emma, when she passed him, the single nod of a man who had always known she would get here. Hector sat in the front pew on William's side in a good jacket that Emma suspected Adeline Morrow had helped him press. Owen sat beside him beaming with the uncomplicated joy of a young man who had been certain of this outcome since December and was glad to have been proven right. Tom sat at the end of the row, straight-backed and present, which was Tom's version of celebration, and Emma received it as such. The minister was brief. William had asked him to be because neither of them needed ceremony to make a true thing more true. What they said to each other at the front of the church, they said looking directly at each other, the way they had always spoken, straight honest without performance. "I promise to tell you the truth," William said when the minister gave him the moment. "Every time. About the hard things and the good things and the things I don't yet know how to say. And I promise to keep looking at you the way I looked at you the first night I walked into that saloon, like you were the person I had been trying to find." Emma held his gaze. She thought about what she wanted to say, what was true and mattered and deserved to be said out loud in front of the people who had watched them both. "I spent 4 years working 3 jobs to survive," she said, "and I thought that was the hardest thing I would ever do. Then you looked at me like I was worth looking at, and it turned out the hardest thing was learning to believe you." She paused. "I believe you. I promise to keep believing you even when it's difficult, and to keep being worth believing. And I promise to manage the accounts because someone has to." A sound went through the church that was somewhere between laughter and something more tender than that. William's real smile, the full, unhidden one she had been collecting since December, appeared and stayed. The minister said the words. They said the words back. And when it was done, and they walked back up the aisle together, Emma looked at the faces of the people in the pews and thought that a year ago she had been invisible in this town, and now she was here, seen real, standing beside a man who had made it his business to see her, and that sometimes the thing that changes everything is one person deciding to look. Outside the church, Owen grabbed Emma's hand and shook it vigorously and said, "I told Hector in December. I told him. December." Hector behind him said nothing and put his hand briefly on Emma's shoulder and nodded once, which meant everything. Tom Aldrich walked up last. He looked at Emma for a moment. Then he put out his hand. She shook it. He said, You do good work, Mrs. Carter. Mrs. Carter. Emma held those two words in her chest for a moment. Not because she was giving up the name she'd been born with. Whitmore was her father's name, and it lived in her and always would. But because Carter meant the ranch and the garden and the kitchen table and the ledger they shared and the mountains seen from the porch every morning with coffee. "Thank you, Tom," she said. He nodded. He stepped back. The smallest possible smile crossed his face and disappeared like a coin glimpsed and pocketed. They went home. That was all. No grand journey, no ceremony beyond the one they'd had. They drove back to the Carter Ranch in the October afternoon, the same road she had ridden 11 months ago, with one trunk and a decision. She wasn't sure she could trust, and they came through the gate and up to the house, and Emma stepped down from the wagon and looked at the house in the afternoon light. Her house now. Not by employment, not by arrangement. Hers. "What are you thinking?" William asked beside her. "I'm thinking about the garden," she said. "What I'll put in on the east side next spring. I think sweet potatoes if the soil will support them. And maybe sunflowers along the fence because they're not practical, and I've decided I want something impractical." William looked at her. "Sunflowers," he said. "Don't look at me like that," she said. "I'm allowed to want something just because it's beautiful." "Yes," he said with a quality in his voice that was not about sunflowers. "You are." He looked at her. They had been doing this for 11 months, looking at each other with everything in it, the practical and the impossible, the ledger and the May evening, and she did not expect to ever get tired of it. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make supper." "Let me help," he said. "You can't cook," she said. "I can hand you things," he said. "That's true," she said. "You're very good at handing me things." They went inside. The years built themselves the way years do on a working ranch, steadily with effort, with the particular accumulation of a life that was being lived rather than survived. The Carter Ranch expanded twice in the next decade. The south pasture became the north pasture, and then both. And Hector trained 2 new hands who learned early that Mrs. Carter ran the accounts and the household, and you confirmed your supply lists with her before you assumed anything. Owen Briggs got married in 1902 to a woman from Billings who had his same open face and his same inability to leave a room where something interesting was happening. Emma stood beside him at the wedding, the way an older sister would, and told his wife that Owen was a good man who needed someone who expected better of him occasionally, and his wife had laughed and said she had that well in hand. Tom Aldrich stayed at the Carter Ranch until 1905, when he moved north to his own small property, something he'd been saving toward for years quietly, in the way Tom did everything. Emma gave him a jar of preserved peaches and a piece of apple pie for the road. He put both hands on her shoulders briefly and said, "You gave me back this place." And Emma understood that he meant he'd been ready to leave before she arrived, and that her presence had changed the quality of working here enough to make him want to stay long enough to save what he needed. She went inside and cried a little quickly, and then went back to her accounts. Hector stayed. He always stayed. He became over the years the particular kind of person who is not family by blood, but is family by accumulation, by the thousands of mornings of coffee and supply lists and fence line assessments, and the occasional crisis handled together. He never said much. He didn't need to. His presence was its own language, and Emma had been fluent in it since October of 1898. She and William had 3 children. A daughter first born in 1901, who had Emma's practical intelligence and William's stillness, and who from the time she could walk, followed Hector through the barn, asking questions he answered with great patience and no condescension. Twin boys in 1904, who were loud and physical and fascinated by cattle, and who had their father's gray eyes and their mother's absolute refusal to back down from anything. Emma raised them the way her father had raised her, not by telling them who to be, but by being herself with complete consistency, so they always had something real to look at. She told them about Daniel Whitmore and the crooked shelf. She told them about the boarding house and the general store and the saloon, not to make them feel her hardship, but to make sure they understood what work actually looked like. She told them that their worth had nothing to do with what anyone else said about them, and everything to do with what they did when nobody was watching. Her daughter at age 7 asked her once why she kept the original employment contract in the box under the bed with the paid-in-full document from Gerald Marsh. Emma thought about how to answer that. Then she said, "Because it's the piece of paper that reminds me that I made choices. Not choices that were made for me, or that I had to make, because I had no other option. Choices I made on purpose, knowing what I was agreeing to and what I wasn't, because I knew my own value, even when nobody else did." She paused. "You keep the things that show you who you were when you were choosing to become who you are." Her daughter looked at her with serious eyes. "Are you who you were choosing to become?" Emma looked at her daughter at this particular face that was hers and William's, and entirely its own, and looked around at the kitchen that was hers, and the ranch that was hers, and the life that had been built from a slammed tray and a corner table and a man who had put his hat in his hands. "Yes," she said. "I think I finally am." In the autumn of 1910, a woman came through Red Hollow. A young woman, 23, working 2 jobs and wearing boots that didn't fit, and carrying a weight in her face that Emma recognized the way you recognize a version of yourself. She came into the general store. Frank Hatcher had retired. His son ran it now, and Emma was there to check a supply order, and she saw the young woman immediately. She watched her for a few minutes. The way the young woman moved, the particular quality of her exhaustion, the way her jaw was set with the determination of a person who has decided not to quit, but isn't entirely sure how long they can keep deciding that. Emma walked over. "Excuse me," she said. The young woman looked up. "Are you looking for work?" The young woman studied her with the wariness of someone who had learned to be careful about what looked like an easy offer. "Depends on what kind," she said. Emma looked at her directly. "The real kind," she said. "Hard work, fair pay, honest arrangement. I'll tell you exactly what's expected, and I won't change the terms once you've agreed." The young woman was quiet for a moment. "Why me?" she asked. "You don't know me." Emma thought about a man who had walked into the Double Crown Saloon 12 years ago and stood up at a corner table without being asked and said, "Go home, Cleet," and then come to a general store counter and put his hat in his hands and said the truest thing anyone had ever said to her. "Because you're still here," Emma said. "And that tells me what I need to know." The young woman looked at her for a long moment, with the careful measuring look of a person deciding whether to trust something that seems too good to be real. Then she put out her hand. Emma shook it. Firm and brief, the handshake of 2 people who meant what they were about to agree to. "Emma Carter," she said. "May Briggs," the young woman said. Then, "Briggs is that Owen's youngest sister," Emma said. "I thought I recognized the face." She smiled. "Come out to the ranch on Thursday. We'll talk about what you need and what we need and make sure they match." May Briggs came on Thursday. She stayed for 3 years until she was ready to build her own next thing, and she left with savings and skills and a clear picture of her own value that she had arrived without. That was how Emma Carter did things. Not loudly, not grandly, but steadily. One person at a time, extending the same hand that had been extended to her on a night in October when she was 26 years old and had everything in her except one person willing to look past the surface and see it. William Carter had looked, and what he'd found had changed both their lives past the point of imagining. The woman who had been mocked for her size while working 3 jobs had built something that would outlast every unkind word ever said about her. She had built a ranch that ran better than any in the county. She had built a family that knew what love looked like when it wasn't performing. She had built a life that was hers, from the foundation to the roof. Every board chosen, every debt paid, every choice made, with full knowledge of what she was worth. She had not been rescued. She had been seen. And being seen, truly seen by one person who meant it, that had been more than enough to build a whole world from. Emma Whitmore. Carter had always known what she was capable of. It had just taken a lonely cowboy and a corner table and a slammed-down tray to give the world the chance to find out. And the world in the end was the better for it.